Well, ever since I saw the Christ, there's been something in my life making me feel like I find a way to be at rest. Now though I stumble now and then, Jesus keep my soul from sin and let me fly to my home to be at rest. Now
I thank God every day, or I try to every day. If I miss a day, I might do it twice the next day. But for the family that I've had, and I feel like that I'm not a wealthy man at all, far from it. But I am a very rich man as a result of the family that I have.
I'm on a wing, so faith to find your way to be at rest, to be at rest.
It's July the 24th, 2001. I'm in Canby, Oregon at my daughter's house, and she asked me to record the experiences of my life from the 10th year on. So this is the beginning of a period in time from 1935, 36 it is now. And this is my 10th year. I've had my 10th birthday, and I'm in my 10th year of life. And my father has just left farming. He's going to work for the state of Kentucky at $75 a month. And Happy Chandler has just become governor, and my father worked hard for him during the election, and he is working with him now. Happy Chandler later on was to become the commissioner of baseball, as well as being the former governor of Kentucky. Anyhow, this was quite a change for my father and our family, because here we were, no more hogs to feed, no more cows to milk, no more crops to prepare for. Still, we had no electricity in this new home, or we didn't have any indoor facilities. But we only stayed a short time here, because my father realized that as a family, we're a family of 7 children, so forth, that you needed a cow to milk and a garden to raise some vegetables in, and so forth. So there's only 3 events I remember at this particular location that we had moved to. It was maybe 8 or 10 houses in the area, and one of them was that I had my first experience with alcohol at that time. Now, remember, I'm 10 years old, and my grandmother, I went with my grandmother to visit a granddaughter whom she had raised, and now she was married, and so this is up in rural Kentucky, in the area where people made whiskey and corn liquor, as they called it. And so I was with her and my cousin, who was about 4 or 5 years older than I was. He got a hold of some whiskey, and we drank some of it. And as a result, I remember I was sick for about a month afterwards, getting over it. So then another event that I remember there, we had moved, where we moved from, we had a smokehouse where we kept our meat. Now, a smokehouse is where, when we'd kill hogs around November or something like that, they would salt the meat down heavily, just cover it completely in salt, rock salt, and then they would smoke it in hickory smoke, and this would preserve the meat so you could have meat throughout the year. That's like ham and the shoulders and the side, the bacon, what we would call bacon to today, but it was, and that was used to cook. Lard was used to cook with. So my father had brought along the meats that we had taken out and put them in a little outbuilding. And one night he heard somebody trying to pry a board off the wall to get to the meat. And he got his shotgun and went outside, and he just, when he pumped the shell into his gun, the neighbor across the street heard it, and she yelled out, "Don't shoot, don't shoot." And then he realized it was her husband that was trying to take our meat. But anyhow, it was resolved, and the other experience that I had there was back in those days, if you had a disagreement with a young fellow or so, you, what we'd call, duke it out. But anyhow, he got angry with me, and he said, "I'm going to go home and get my gun and shoot you." And I said, "Well, I'll just go with you." And so we walked down to his house, and he went inside, and I'm standing outside with my arms folded and big, brave 10-year-old. Anyhow, he came, and I don't think he pointed at me, but he fired. It went off, and boy, I took off running and ran home, and I'd heard that if you were shot, you didn't necessarily feel it right off the bat. So I couldn't feel anything, but I realized that he hadn't shot me. But since then, I've never dared a guy to shoot me. So from that time, we didn't stay there long, as I said, because my father realized that we needed a garden. We needed some milk cows to supply the family and so forth. And so we moved a short distance away. And this was it had more facilities. We had a little barn where we could keep a couple of cows, and we had a little acreage where we could have some gardening. And so there, but in all three of these, the first place and the second place and now the third place, I attended the same school. Now this was a two-room school. It consisted of 4 grades, and the first 4 grades in one room, and the second 4 grades in the second, that is, from the first grade through the 8th grade. And after people completed the 8th grade, then they were bused to the county high school. Now, this school was provided for. It was in walking distance for everyone, which was maybe a mile or 2 at the most would be. And it also didn't have electricity, and it did not have indoor facilities like running water and so forth. So it had its own well. The school, that is, had its own well, its pot-bellied stove to heat the facility during the winter months. And I recall that we'd have recess. You would go out and play. It had a playground. Wasn't anything on the playground except just the area where we would do foot races and play. And it's the first time in my life I ever experienced having the breath knocked out of me. And we were doing some game, I forget what tag or somebody hit me real hard right in the stomach area, and it knocked the breath out. And if you've ever had that happen, you know you think you're dying, but you're finally able to gasp some air, and it was okay. And I remember the teachers on a Friday, especially, we would have a spelling bee each Friday where one group would take on another group, and it was a lot of fun. And that's where possibly I started out in life learning to a lot of definition of words and how to spell them and so forth. And for discipline, the teacher had a cedar paddle. It was about, I'd say 10 inches long and maybe 4 inches wide, and it had somebody had taken a hot poker and bored holes through it. Those holes would make it sting more. And if you did something in class that was, or before you got to class, if you deserved, they would take you to the cloakroom, or that was a little place where you hung your coats and hats, and was supposed to be a deterrent, I suppose. And I recall one time, now that, remember this is 1936, so it'd be in the 36th or 37th year, that a dirigible, which today they call them blimps, came over, and everybody, neighbors came running and or those close to the school, come out and see this. And this was quite an event. It was hard to imagine that here was 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, how many people was in it, that were 400 or 500 feet up in the air, just moving along at a very slow pace, but they were up there in the air. And the only time I recall ever seeing an airplane was maybe at that time a two-seater that landed in one of the neighbors' pastures. And so that was the experience in kind of the school, if you can imagine, that we went to, and so forth. Now our next move was to Pilot View, Kentucky. In Pilot View, here we changed schools and everything, and it was back on the farm again, because my older brother, who was 2.5 years older than I am, or was, and he and I, there, my father was wanting to get us somewhere where we could provide, help provide for the family. So he got an agreement that my brother and I would raise an acre of tobacco for this family. Now, in raising an acre of tobacco, there's quite a bit of work. First thing you had to do, was to till the ground that you were going to plant it in. But the first thing, we had to plant a bed, what we called for the plants. And this, it would be tilled very finely, and then we'd had a piece of fence, like wire fence, and we put logs and woods and kindling like things, and you would burn it, maybe burn it for 30 minutes, then you'd move the fire up to the next section, and the bed was about 50 foot long by about 8 foot wide. And then after you did that so you would kill all the weeds and grass seed that might be in that soil. And so you would burn it for that purpose. Then following that, now how did we move it? We did have our tools of operation. We had an old pot-bellied mule. He was named Joe, Old Joe we called him. And we had a sled. Didn't have a wagon, but we had a sled on runners that we could carry things, loads back and forth and so on, and a log chain. And we would hook that log chain to the fence, and as a result, we would, when after you burned a certain place, hook up the chain, and old Joe would pull logs and ashes and all the residue along with it up to the bed. Well, then after you planted the bed, this would be about, late February, and then you would put the seeds in, and they would begin to sprout not too long, because you would dampen it down every few days if you didn't have rain. And then the seeds would come up. Then you would have to thin it so you would get good plants, because you might throw a tobacco seed is a very small. It's can't think of some, maybe the size of a raspberry seed, maybe would be a good example. So you would thin them out so you would get healthy plants, and you would weed them, make sure no weeds were growing in there. So you'd roll it back and have to do that. Now, once the plants were maybe 6 inches long, that's when you would you had to plow the field. And so old Joe and a plow, you'd have to plow, and it takes quite a while to plow an acre of land with just a mule and a single row plow. And so after that, then you would set the tobacco, and you'd have just a wooden peg. Maybe you'd cut off a limb where you'd have a little grip to it, and you'd sharpen the end, and you'd ram it in the soil and put the plant down in it and pull the dirt up over it. And so then, following the planting, then you would had a little plow to keep the ground loose, so to speak, and using a hoe, you would go by and hoe those plants. So anyhow, it was a continual effort from the time that you started preparing the bed until you would harvest. Always jobs to be done in the field. And so when it came almost harvest time, so the plants would grow out. You'd what you call top it. You'd go through and break off the top. That's the part that would produce seed if you were raising seed plants and so forth. But it would cause the plants to bush out at the bottom. And the most important leaves, the higher price leaves at least, were on the bottom ring of it, or on the bottom of the stalk. And they got progressively, the price that you would get per pound for the tobacco would get progressively lesser as you moved up the stalk, and the ones at the top of the stalk was the least expensive, brought the least amount of money. And so anyhow, at harvesting, then you've planted it, and you've hoed it, and you've cared for it all these months, and about September, you would harvest it. And that you go through and cut it, the stalk at the time, and you had tobacco sticks, we called them. They were about 6 foot long. No, they wouldn't be about 5 foot long. And stick them in the ground, and you had a spear, a metal spear that you put on top of it, and you'd spear that stalk right down, and you put about 6 to 8 on each one, plants. And then you would load it on a wagon, and you'd take it to the barn, and we had tier barn, tobacco barn, where the had rails laid out in it about between about 4.5 foot apart, and you would hang each one of those. Then you would open the side doors of the barn and let it what you call cure the tobacco. Then in the curing stage, also you might use coke stoves inside the barn to heat it up, and that would dry and make it dry. Now when it got to the cured, as C-U-R-E-D is the word, then at the first hard rain, it would soften up before it was pliable, because it would absorb the moisture. Then you would put it down into a pile. You would put it into a bed where it would keep, and you'd cover that with a tarpaulin. And then you were ready to what we call strip the tobacco. stripping was where I referred to earlier. The bottom leaves, you'd put them by grade. The highest grade were at the bottom, and as it worked up, so you had about four to five grades in it. Then you stripped them off and separated them into grades. And now you were ready to go to market. And when we went to market that particular year, the auctioneer was those of you that are old enough to remember, Forrest Boone, who advertised Lucky Strike cigarettes, used to say, $18. It's hard to, I didn't know what they were saying, but anyhow, my brother and I had raised that, and I was 12 and he was 14. And they set us up on the basket, and the auctioneer said before they started, now these young men raised this tobacco on their own. They did every bit of it, from the planting to the stripping of it to bringing it to market. And I want you guys to treat them right today. And that day we received the highest price that was paid for tobacco that particular day. And so we got a little write-up in the paper that these two young boys had done this and achieved it, and which we were very proud of. And that's the last year that my father ever gave me any money. Until I was graduating from college, he gave me $5 on my ring for when I graduated from college. But he had given us the opportunity. We bought our clothes out of that for that year. And one particular thing I remember we bought a .22 rifle, and we ordered from Montgomery Ward, which Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward were the two big catalog companies that really served America back at that time. And we paid, as I recall, $3.27 for that rifle. And that rifle, I became a pretty good shot. And when we'd want meat for dinner or something, and my mother was looking for something different than chickens and so forth, that I would take the rifle and go to the woods and find a squirrel. And I'll jump ahead and tell you that the last squirrel I ever had, or clean, was when Janet was born. Now this was now we've jumped really ahead, this was 1947. And I was in college at that time, and I'd gone squirrel hunting and was cleaning the squirrels. And which she came outside, and she was like 2 or a couple of years old at that time, very small. But she looked at it and she said, "Daddy, that looks like a rat." Well, I think that's the last squirrel I ever ate, because that stuck in my mind. But anyhow, that rifle, and I would kill varmints and so forth on the place that were destroying crops or something, shoot them. And at that, when we sold the tobacco that day, afterwards, coming back to that, the owner of the warehouse came by and he said, "Somebody left this little dog here, and nobody's claimed him. He's been here for a day. Would you boys be interested in this dog?" And he was a cute little fellow. We called him Tex, but we took him home. He didn't stand very tall. He was maybe a little smaller than a beagle, but instead of being a beagle, he had real long ears that flopped down. And I came to Tex, as we called him. He was with us, I don't know, a year or two, and one day old Joe kicked him in the back. And back in those days, you didn't take animals to the vet or anything, because people didn't have money. But he was in horrible pain. It broke his back, and he's yelping. And they said, "Well, we're going to have to put him down." And putting him down in those days meant getting the the gun and shooting. And I remember I was being a good shot that I said that he's my dog and I'll shoot him. And with tears running down my face, I shot, and he didn't suffer any at all because it was a good shot. But anyhow, it's an event that I shall never forget. And another thing that happened there at this place, I remember my younger brother, Albert, but we call him Happy because he was named after Governor Chandler, and they called him Happy Chandler, but he was named Albert was his first name. So my brother Albert, who was he's 10 years, so he was about 2 years old at that time. One day they came over to the school. We lived maybe within about a half mile of the school, and someone came running and said, your little brother's lost. And so they turned out the whole school to go look for him on the farm. It was about 100 and some odd acres in the farm, and lots of woods and lots of area to be covered. And so we all turned out, and we looked, and nobody was having any luck. And after about a couple hours or so of searching, here he comes staggering out, rubbing his eyes from the little kind of a small barn. It wasn't the tobacco barn, but another little barn that we had there where it had some hay in it and so forth. And he had crawled up in the hay and gone to sleep. So it was an event that I remember. And I remember another time with an older man he was probably, we would be classed as Alzheimer's, but I never heard that word until just recent years. But he probably had Alzheimer's. He wandered away one time, and I remember all the neighbors, how people came together at that time. The fire department from this city, which was about 15 miles away, and all the people from all around came from everywhere. It was at night, and it was kind of cool. And they searched a light. I can remember all the lights and all the people working and concerned over this man. And they finally found him, but it was a long time, and he was all right. It was an event that I remember during that period of time. Now, that's a year that we had gotten cows when we moved from the first place that I referred to, when we had gardening and everything. And at the age of 12, that's when I did all the milking and taking care of the animals. And we would had an old hog, and her name was Betsy, and we had her bred, my brother and I did. And when the pigs weighed about 40 pounds each, we sold them for $1 a piece. Now, today you can't even buy a pound of meat for $1 of pork. But I remember that was $1, and that was in the heart of the Depression when they Roosevelt had come into power and as president, and they were killing a lot of the hogs throughout the nation to try to drive the price of them up. The government would give them a small amount for them to get rid of them, so they wouldn't be, because supply and demand is what causes prices to be what they are in anything. And so they had just mass slaughters of hogs so that they would get a supply and demand more in order. And I recall that. And at that place was also the first time I had broken ribs. I remember I was going to, my aunt lived maybe a mile away on another farm, And I was going to her house with an 8-pound, what we call a lard bucket then. They didn't have oils like we have now, canola oil and all of that. People's cooked with lard, and lard came from the fat of the hog. But anyhow, you'd put those in buckets when you slaughtered the hogs. You would boil the fat part of the hog and get the lard, which they would keep, and they would use that all year, have that all year long, and if you ran out, that's what you bought at the stores. But anyhow, we got in our first bicycle from that crop that we raised. Also, we got a bicycle out of it. I don't remember the price, what we paid for that, but it wasn't very much. And anyhow, I was riding the bicycle, and that bucket got caught between my knee and the handlebar and just caused it to jerk sideways and threw me, rammed the handlebars in my ribs, and so I'm laying out on the highway, and I'm in great pain. But I got home, and I didn't ride. I pushed the bicycle home, and we went to the doctor, and they taped me up, and that's when I was having trouble breathing, but that's what it turned out to be, a broken rib. So that was my first experience in that area. And one of the most memorable things that I remember there was December the 7th, 1941. I was 15 years old, and my parents had gone to visit some of our relatives that day, and my brother Edsel and I had stayed home together, and we turned on the radio and found out that we had been attacked by the Japanese. And I recall distinctly how he was being 2.5 years older. He was going to go immediately, and I said to him, "I'll never get the opportunity. I'm too young." But it didn't turn out that way. I did find that I did go, and we'll talk about that later. But I'll always remember where I was and what I was doing when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The sports that I played at that time, we played a little basketball and baseball, and I played guard on the 8th grade team, and we didn't have uniforms or anything, so we took undershirts and cut material out and put our numbers on the undershirts. Nobody had much money back in those times, and we played on dirt court. I always remember my first game when we went in and played on hardwood. And boy, and I thought that was the most wonderful thing in the world, and how excited I was in playing in that game. And the other experience that I tell you about, I played second base on the baseball team, and we had a shortstop by the name of Earl Hammonds. Earl and I were best buddies. In fact, he was he was best man at my wedding, in fact. But Earl and I were good buddies, but he played shortstop, and he was a much better baseball player than I was. And he was so good that if, possibly he could have made it to the the AA baseball in today's world, but the war and things changed all of that. But anyhow, one day this kid had hit a line drive right, and I was cutting in to take it, and he cut right in front of me, and he was so good I just dropped my hands down, but he missed this one, and it went right through and hit me on the right cheek, right below the eye, and of course it knocked me unconscious, and they told me this after I came to, that it had knocked my eyeball out on my face, that it just was hanging down on he said on a cord like. He said didn't look like it ought to be there to me, so I just put it back in. But the doctor later told us if he hadn't have done that, I would have lost my eye because it had swollen so quickly that there's no way that they could have got it back in. And a lot of events have happened, but that's one that I'm glad that Earl was there and put that eye back where it belonged. Now, following that, we moved for the last place that I would live with my family. And this is an area where now I'm 15 years old when I make this move. And within just a couple of few months, I was going to be 16. And they approached me at that time about driving a school bus. That they thought that I was a mature young man, and I remember the superintendent talking to me, and he had trying to figure which ones he could use, and he felt like that I would be someone. And so I started driving a school bus when I was 16 years old. And I had two events there that I can tell you about. And I remember one time I had one area on my route that I had to drive about 2 miles around a hill, or some people would refer to it as a mountain, but it really wasn't a mountain. It was more of just a big hill alongside the river that you couldn't pass another car. There was, you either one of you had to back up if you met there. So anyhow, I'd gotten almost to the end. Maybe I'm 200 feet from being to the end, and a car pulled up, and I stuck my head out to pull the side window apart, and I said, "Sir, you're going to have to back up." And he said, "I can't back up." And I said, "Well," I thought he was just being obstinate. So I said, "Well, yes, you are. You don't expect me to back this bus all the way back to let you by, do you?" And he said, "I can't." Well, I said, "Go ahead and back it up." And I was kind of in an angry tone. And he put it in gear, and all at once he went zoom, and he ran through a fence, and he's down in a ditch in the fence. And I jumped out of the bus and ran down there, and he said, "I told you I couldn't back up." I said, "I'm sorry, I misunderstood you, because if I thought you meant that you actually couldn't back up, that I would have gotten out of the bus and backed it up for you." But it's kind of a funny incident in which things like that stick with you for a lifetime. But another event that I recall happening, that I was on the route and picked up a young man, and just before, when he saw the bus coming, he ran, and it was a barbed wire fence. Had a barbed wire on the top of the fence, and he leaped over the fence, and it got him right in the side of the arm, and it just tore all the way down for maybe a 6-inch gash, and it was pretty deep. And so we gave him what attention we could, but I said, "You've got to go." And he said, "Well, my parents are gone." I said, "You've got to go to the hospital." So I went when we got to school, which wasn't very far from there, I told the teacher, I said, "This young man's got to go to the hospital." She said, "Well, I can't leave." And I said, "Well, I'll take him." And she said, and I said, "I'll get him back somehow." So I took him to the hospital, and that little guy, he said, wanted me to stay with him or something. And I went into where they sewed, and they started sewing him up, and I began to feel a little queasy. And I went outside and I got on the elevator, and that's the last thing I remember. I had passed out cold. When we got up to, when I woke up, I wake up in all these white uniforms, nurses in white, how they used to wear the white starched uniform. They're around me, and I thought I hadn't made it, that I was some other place now. But anyhow, I was a little ashamed of the fact that I fainted, but I did. I just passed out cold. And but other jobs that I had there, and probably one of the smartest men I ever worked for. Just one summer. Then in the summer, I'd get any job that I could, and but he was working tarring, it's TAR, tarring roofs, and he was paying $1 an hour, I believe. Well, it was most money I had. Yes, it was about $1, because I was working in a clothing factory at that time for the summer. I was called a bundle boy. They made uniforms for the Army. My job was to bring the material to the seamstresses. They must have had about 40 of them there, and then after they completed whatever part of the job that they were supposed to do, whether it's to sew the legs up, because it was all in a kind of a assembly line type things, I would move it to the next location and so forth. But anyhow, I told the manager, I said, hey, I've got an opportunity. I can make 40 more cents an hour than I'm making here. I was getting 60 cents there. And tarring these roofs, and, I don't have all that much time to work during the summer, and I can use the money. And so he said, well, you can't leave. And back then, you couldn't leave a job if it was connected with something with national emergency, I don't know what to call it, national something. And I said, well, fire me. He said, you can't quit. I said, well, fire me then. He said, why? I'm not going to fire you. He said, you're going to work here. So anyhow, I went on a one-man sit-down strike. I said, well, if you want to pay me for doing nothing, that's all right. And after about an hour or so of that, and all the women laughing, I remember how they'd laugh. Here's this 16-year-old kid that's on strike. Anyhow, the boss came over, and he said, Jay, I'm not going to fire you, so I'm going to give you a release. And so I got a release and went to work. But this guy I went to work for, he was one sharp cookie. He was a graduate of Annapolis U.S. Naval Academy, and he was an older man, so he wasn't in service now. And but he would take us to the job, and I didn't figure this out maybe until after I'd even left, it didn't work for him anymore. But he would take us to the job, us being 2 or 3 other guys and myself, and we were all high school kids. And he would give us about a day and a half job, and he would say, now, if you finish this today, I won't pay you for the full day. And I'll be back to pick you up because he furnished our transportation, took us to, he never stayed around and told us what to do or so forth, outside of outlining in the beginning what the job consisted of. And he'd come back, and we'd worked our tails off. But we were going to show him we could get it done shorter than that period of time. And then when he came back, I can't believe you guys could do this. I can't believe you finished it. He knew how to rub our egos and how to stroke us. And but he was a good man to work for. He always paid and paid us as we were supposed to do. But I've always thought back and thought how wise he was, how to get work out of young men without supervising or saying, you do this, you do that, and so forth. He did it through psychology, so to speak. So that was one of the jobs I had, and now this was the time shortly thereafter that an event in my life that has really made my life, so to speak. That during this period of time, I had a friend, and her father and mother ran a restaurant. And I was in there one day, and we were chatting, and I was having Coke or something, I don't remember. but I noticed this young girl came in, and she sat down at the counter. They had booths up at front, and back in the back was a long counter where maybe they could seat 15 or 20 people that would come in for a meal on a stool. And she was having a Coke, and I asked my friend Carlene, I said, "Who is that?" And she said, "Oh, that's Eva Dunaway. Would you like to meet her?" And I said, "I sure would." and so that's how I met Grandma. And and that was in August of 1943. And the story, and there'll be much more about that, but that's probably the greatest thing ever happened in my lifetime to me. And following that, now I'm in high school. Got a good job. I'm making $60 a month driving a school bus, and so I could have things that maybe other students couldn't have. I was providing for myself, and I was kind of on top of the world, so to speak. And so that was in 43. Now in 1944, and probably it was about February, knowing that after I finished high school, that I would be drafted. A couple of my buddies, Earl Hammonds, whom I mentioned earlier, and Owen Epperson, we went down to the and volunteered for the Navy, and that we would leave as soon as we were graduated from high school, which would be in May. We're going to go back just for a moment to July the 5th, 1937. That's when my oldest sister, Helen, died. It's very memorable. There's two incidents that day that shook up a 11-year-old boy, and that was, it's the first time I'd ever seen my father break down and cry. And when they told him he arrived home, I remember him getting out of the car, and when he was told, he was sobbed, and the first time I'd ever seen him cry. And also that day, that morning before she died, a huge, what we call a cow snake, crawled up on the screen and was outlined on the screen door, and people would say that was an omen and so forth during that period of time, but I remember it. And also, while we lived there, when her husband died and she came to live with us, she had a German Shepherd, it was part German Shepherd dog, and I had Old Sooner, whom I had told about in the first 10 years of my life, and Old Sooner and her dog were poisoned by a neighbor, or we think he was the one that did it. He put some strychnine in hamburger-like meat and threw it in the yard. Anyhow, it poisoned both of our dogs, and I was 11 at that time. My brother Edsel was 13, and I remember both of us, we pricked our fingers to draw a little blood and put our thumbs together, that we would take an oath that when we got large enough that we would beat this neighbor up. Anyhow, years passed, and I had gone into the Navy and had returned, and my father and I were downtown Winchester, and this man came along, was a walking cane and could barely walk and so forth, and my father said, "Jay, you remember Mr. I can't think of his last name at this time, and the thought ran through my mind, this is the man that poisoned our dog, and I'm supposed to beat this fella up. But I didn't do it, but I always remember the moment. And a couple of other things at the next place that we lived when I was 12 years old and raised the tobacco and so forth, that I did all the milking from the time I was 12 years old on till I left home. But I used to take my little brother, Happy, who would have been 2 years old, about 2 years old at that time. I'd take him milking with me, and he and the cat would follow me when I got the milk bucket to go to the barn, and they would sit about 6 or 8 feet from me, and I would take the cow's teat and squirt, and they'd hold their mouths open, both the cat and Happy, and it was something that you don't forget. But when I would take him back to the house, he would just be covered with dried milk and hair in his hair and everywhere, and so that's something that you remember. And also, I remember that this was still in the Depression years, and people didn't have a lot of money. And my brother and I, Edsel, we had take old Joe, the mule, and we would go out into the woods and cut a tree down, knock and chop the small limbs off of it and tie a log chain around it, and old Joe would drag it back in to where we had a cross saw. He'd pull one end, I would pull the other, and we would have so much wood. My father would check us each week because he was traveling, would be out of town maybe for the, at least he was gone during the daytime, and sometimes he was gone overnight, and at the end of the week we had to have so much wood checked that would carry us through the next winter. See, back in those times you always were preparing for the months ahead, and we were praying to have enough wood to last us through the winter. And I know we developed pretty good arm strength at that time, because you pull a crosscut for a couple hours a day every day for 5 days or 6 days a week. You could build up some muscle, but anyhow. And at this time also is when I saw my first moving picture, and the name of it, I was 12 years old, and the name of the movie was Jesse James. And I'm trying to think who the actors were, but it escapes me just for the moment. But I know I liked that sucker, and I sat through it for twice. I stayed for another showing of it. And so those are something I wanted to bring you up to date. It's July the 26th, 2001. This is being videotaped by my grandson, Douglas J. Burnett, and we're in Lincoln City, Oregon, and in the background is the Pacific Ocean. It's where I spent the last part of my 18th year, all of my 19th year, and part of my 20th year, somewhere out there. I left for the Navy on June the 6th, 1944. I was in charge of the draftees and enlistees, which I was 18 years old at the time, which was kind of an honor that they selected me with a lot of married men and men a lot older than myself. But we were sent to Louisville, Kentucky for induction. Then we were transferred to Great Lakes, Illinois for basic training. There we learned a few things, and some of the things we did a little boxing while I was there, and that's the first time that I was ever knocked out. In fact, I had boxed this fellow from Wisconsin one time and had won, and I was pretty cocky, and so we got in the ring, and he hit me with a haymaker, and like I say, that's the only time I recall ever being knocked out while boxing. And the things that I remember, few things that I remember there distinctly was, I remember every morning you would wake up to the Stars and Stripes Forever. And also at the rifle range where we were training as a kid, as I mentioned before, I was a pretty good shot with the rifle. And we were on the range, and I was hitting the bullseye every time, but boy, blood was coming down my face, and the instructor came over, and I said, I'm not having any trouble hitting the bullseye, but it's beating me up pretty good too. And he said, let me watch you fire off a couple of rounds. And he did, and when he said that, he said, you've got your thumb over the stock, and your thumb is coming back and hitting you in the nose, and that's the reason you've got a bloody nose. He said, put your finger on the side, and so that solved the problem. After basic training, I was transferred to Fort Pierce, Florida, into what they call the amphibious forces. And at this particular base, they trained the scouts and raiders. They were the people who went in before an invasion and set up. They'd go in 2 or 3 days ahead and hide among the enemy, and so they could direct in and the landing forces. And also, they trained underwater demolition. These were the people who went in and blew out they'd go in with the scouts and raiders, but they would blow out all obstacles in the water, like they'd put big iron things so the boats would be snagged trying to come ashore. And they would blow this out, and then they had the small boats, and that's what I was in. We were the crew of 4, and we had a coxswain, we had a engineer, we had a gunner, and we had a signalman. I was the signalman, and also operated as a gunner also. We had it would carry 20, these landing vehicles, personnel, LCVPs they called them, and they would take in 26 troops. And anyhow, that's where we trained, and they had a very high casualty training rate there. They lost a lot of people because of the very strenuous ways that you were trained. We weren't trained to maim or cripple people. We were trained to kill people, and of course that was war. And toward the end of it, they offered us, one of my vivid memories is they offered, they wanted volunteers for 6 small boat crews, and they would give a 2-week leave for anybody that volunteered. Well, the coxswain and the gunner and myself wanted to volunteer, and the engineer said no, he wasn't going to volunteer, but you had to volunteer as a group. So anyhow, we didn't go. However, we learned later that all that did go, they didn't get the leave, and none of them came back. So I'll always think our engineer's name was Sawyer, and I'll always remember his name. And after we finished there in training, which is very rigorous and sometimes dangerous, but when we left there, we went through Little Creek, Virginia. Then we were only there for just a short period of time and transferred to Boston, Massachusetts, to pick up our ship. And we picked up a ship which is the LST 972. And 972 has always been favorite numbers with me if I'd go to the racetrack or something. And I recall one time that I was traveling to Los Angeles. This is later in years, and I got off the plane, and I had to kill some time, and Hollywood Racetrack was close by, so I went over, and first race I bought a 9.7 and a 9.2. I hadn't even seen a program, and it came in and paid like $1,000. So it was from that ship number. That's just an aside. In Boston, we stayed in an old hotel there, and one instance I remember in particular, I had guard duty, and it was Sunday, and I took some prisoners. These were guys that had violated the rules and done something to our people, but they wanted to go to church, so I took them to Mass. And I recall there I am, I'm armed with a 45 on my hip, and I had to stand in the back, and you couldn't take your cap off when you were on guard duty, so I'm standing there during that period of time, and it's just an incident that I remember. After we picked up our ship, we had to go to New York, and as we sailed into New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty was that's where you got all your berthing instructions. They were in charge of all ships coming in and out of the harbor. And I remember taking berthing instructions from the Statue of Liberty. And there we left and went down to Chesapeake Bay, where we did our shakedown cruise. And the incident there are two things that I remember that were, stick in my mind. And one is the fact that one of the officers that was instructing us on the shakedown cruise one night had to go, or wanted to go in to see his family, so we were assigned to take him ashore. And it was a cold, I remember it was cold because ice was forming in the salt water, and when it's forming in the salt water, it's pretty cold. And so when we dropped him off, we decided, instead of going around this huge ice floe, that we would just get up speed and go through it. Well, we got about halfway through, and the boat stalled, and the engineer took his boards up from the bilge and was working trying to get it fixed, and we had on rabbit fur gear, which is heavy clothing that land in rabbit fur, and anyhow, I was going around the boat sending SOSs and maydays, trying to get help for us while he was working on it. But in the meantime, as I was doing this, I was circling the entire boat. I tripped, didn't realize the bilge boards was open, and I fell into the water and got all wet, and as a result it began to freeze on me. But anyhow, we were fortunate, and he finally got the engine started and we got back to the ship. But when we did, I couldn't, they call them the falls that you had to hook on, big hooks that you hooked on to lift your boat up. And I was so stiff, frozen stiff, that they had to send a net down and put me in a net and take me back aboard. And but anyhow, well, it's the only time I can say that I got a shot of brandy to kind of bring me back to life, but everything turned out okay. And the other thing that I remember there is, you remember I was 18 years old, and I wasn't a skilled seaman, but anyhow, we were doing a night run, and I accidentally turned the light on. We were traveling under darkness, and all at once behind me I could hear the captain pull his gun out of his holster and he put it up behind my head, and I thought, boy, this is it. Then I heard him uncock it, and I began to feel a little better. And he said to me, he said, son, he said, out here we play for keeps. And he said, no one will ever one man won't endanger my ship. And he said, but I think, he put his arm across my shoulders, and he said, I think you've learned a lesson. I said, I have, sir. And so that was that. And after we left Chesapeake Bay, we had had our guns put on before. That's when we went to New York. That's what happened there. And we left, and the first stop that we made was in Cuba, and at Guantanamo Bay. And I remember going into Havana to get with the crew to get supplies and so forth. But don't have much memory there. But one thing I do remember about this, we left there and went down through the Panama Canal. But on the way down, even after we left Chesapeake Bay, we had a fella, he was one who cut all of our hair and everything, and he was sick from the time we first left the harbor, and I remember him having a bucket and cutting our hair, then going over to the bucket and barfing. But finally, when we got to the Panama Canal, he was just nothing but a walking skeleton, and so they took him off and sent him back to stateside for where he could. He wasn't fit for sea duty, to put it that way. Then we left there, and we were supposed to go to San Francisco. But on the way up, I remember we stayed close to the coast because we didn't have an escort. We were just a lone ship, and that they were trying to evade any submarines or anything of that nature. But we arrived in San Francisco, and I got a message. We were all looking forward to that and everything, but I got a message. Took a message that said proceed to Seattle, and so we had to turn, and we went to Seattle, and that's where we picked up our combat load. And just when we were getting into Seattle, I was taking messages back and forth from the bridge and all the stuff involved, and I was going to be get to go on the first leave. Well, backing up just a little bit, after we left Panama Canal, we thought we were going, that was it. We wouldn't see any more of the states, so all of us shaved our heads, or not all of us, but some of us. But anyhow, when we got to Seattle, I was anxious to get everything completed, and I was moving very fast, and someone hollered from the bridge, to do this or that or whatever it was, and I turned my head, and at the same time I hit a guy wire just above my eye, but as a result, when I went ashore, I looked like I'd been in a major fight. I had a huge black eye and everything, but other than that, I don't remember too much. Then we set out for Hawaii. It would be our next stop, and when on the way over, only one incident I remember, we picked up a signal on radar, sonar, was that we were being followed. And what that meant was, I was pretty sure it was a submarine. And this was like at midnight, and they tracked us all night, stayed about the same distance behind us, and so we went to what they call evasive maneuver, and that's where you change course every 5-10 minutes in a kind of a zigzag position. In fact, this year they just let the well, they had court-martialed the captain of the Indianapolis, and for not going into that maneuver when they lost a lot of men in World War II, and all the people who survived that had always fought for their captain not being court-martialed as he has been, and this year they relieved him, removed the court-martial from his record. But anyhow, so it was getting toward daylight, and we went to general quarters at just before the break of day, because that's when normally you're expected to be hit. And so as a result, I was on the forward gun station at Battle Station, because I had realized in the beginning that the tower, if you were being attacked, the first place they tried to get was the tower, the conning tower, which I generally operated on. But I was also like guns and so forth, so I was on the forward gun up front, furthermost up at the bow. The center one, there was 3 sets of them up there. There was one in the center and 2 on each side. But nothing happened, and we assumed that due to the fact the size of the ship we were and so forth, we weren't big enough a prize for the submarine to want to use its torpedoes on. So anyhow, we proceeded on to Pearl Harbor, and I recall when we entered Pearl Harbor that we had a shipmate whose brother was entombed in the Arizona, and about a fourth of it was still sticking out of the water when they had bombed on the original raid on Pearl Harbor. And that is a vivid memory. And also remember there, as we were leaving, there we had picked up supplies, and we weren't there but just a very short period of time. We were going out, one of the aircraft carriers, and I want to think it was the Lexington, it could have been another one, we passed it, and you couldn't believe that something that had been bombed that much was still afloat. It had fought in one of the major sea battles, and they were bringing it in for repairs, but you could see through the side of it from one side where the kamikazes had just riddled it, but they didn't sink it. But I'll always remember seeing that ship as it was coming, as we passed it as we were going out. Then from there we went on to a little island called Anawita. I think it was in the Marshalls, but I'm not exactly sure about that. But anyhow, that was the first leave that we had had, or leave being able to go ashore, and we went ashore for a couple of hours or so, and it was good to set our feet on land again, because it had been many days since we had. And from there we went to the Philippines, and we went in at Leyte Gulf, and that was the original invasion. It had already taken place. We weren't in the original force, but there was action going on, and as we were going in, it was the first casualty that I saw, and it was a Japanese soldier, and it looked like he had been in the water for several days, because he was bloated and rather looked twice as large as he probably was. But the thing I remember about it is one of the guys on the ship hollered, "Don't let the cook see him." And that sticks in your mind at times that things happen. And so we were in the Philippines, and 2 things that I remember most vividly is the children. had banded together because they'd probably, I don't know all the facts, of course, but they had banded together and they lived in little packs, like 8 or 10 to a group. And you'd see them come out of a hole under a building, and they were very adept at surviving for themselves. For instance, if you had a watch with a leather band on, they all seemed to have little knives or something, and they could run by you and cut that band and have you watch before you knew what happened. But I used to take a pocket full of gum or candy as I'd go, and I would give some out and so forth, but it sticks in my mind. And the other thing that I remember, I'll never forget the smell of decaying human flesh. It's a smell you never forget, and so it's the two things I remember most about that is the children and the odor of war. Anyhow, we spent quite a while there and around, and saw a lot of things, and things that you don't forget, and a lot of experiences. But one I'll tell you about is that one night they were snipers in the area, and we had some concern. And I had it's like, I don't know, maybe 8, I was on 8 to 12. We always served 4-hour shifts, is what you would be on. But I was on the bridge alone because we were at anchor, so and I generally sat inside the conning tower in the captain's chair, because waiting for any messages to come in, or you had a speaker system there that if any emergency came up, you grab it and call. But this particular night, I got in my head somehow that this guy was after me alone, because they better targets probably, but I had to stay. The signal equipment that we used, it was on a kind of shape like that where you could turn 360 degrees. In other words, you could take a message from any direction. And of course, I got a call and I had to go out and answer it. And because when I got several of them, but when I did, I'd go out and get the message real quick and get the heck back inside. But this particular night, after I took a message, I was so anxious to get back, you had to turn it off at the base, which was down right at the bottom. And to send or turn, you had to turn it on or off. So when I bent down to turn it off, next thing I know, I'm flat on my back, and I think I come to, and I think I've been hit, and I started feeling all over myself, and I couldn't find any wet places or anything. And when I got up to my head, when I ran it along, I felt a goose egg up there, and what I had done, I had knocked myself colder than a cucumber. Unintentionally, of course, but I remember, and that's the last time I remember having that particular feeling. But in another event that happened there, that one night some of the guys told me, that they came up and told me I was on duty, that they were going to slip ashore for a while. They'd had it. And they said, now, if anything comes up, we had red lights and green lights with hoods on them. And that was when you were wanting to conceal your message just to a particular party, and it didn't spread out much. But they said if we get something that we're going to have to go or lift anchor, generally it'd take you an hour to get underway if just getting ready to, if you were shut down and at anchor. And they said send 3 red flashes down the beach. I said okay. And so I'm sitting in the captain's chair daydreaming and thinking about things, and I hear these cries, and I thought it was maybe children's sounds coming from the beach or something, and it didn't dawn on me. It was help, 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 until I realized what it was. So I knocked it off, the hood off the light, and shone it down in the water, and there's our two guys. One of them has the other one by the neck, and he's pulling him along, and the guy is in. So I grabbed the mic and I cried, man overboard, and all immediate response was that our guys came out, and about 50 of them jumped over the side. This way they were doing it twofold: one, to try to save them, and the other, to keep them cover up for them. Who was actually in the water? Who was the ones that wasn't supposed to be there in the first place? But anyhow, after I went off, after I was relieved, because it was close to the time for me to go off, the captain looked for me all night, and the guys would be ahead of him, and they'd say he's on the starboard side. I'd shift over to go to the port side. He couldn't find me, and I don't think he really wanted to that bad, but he had to. He never mentioned it the next day, because he figured maybe I was in on it or something. But that was an event. Then the next thing that I remember, we'd been there, a long time, about 7 or 8 months at that point. Then it's August the 14th, 1945, and that's when that they announced we were training with the that particular day we were training with the 7th Cavalry that had come over from Europe to invade Japan. And we were on maneuvers that day and with them, and practice landings and getting them ashore, the tanks and so forth. And they announced that the Japanese surrendered, and I always remember the euphoria I felt when I thought, it's over, I made it. I'm going to go home. Of course, it was some time after, because I was kind of thinking it was over, like we'd leave to go home the next day, but that wasn't the case. We took the first troops in up on Hokkaido, which is the northernmost island of Japan, and there I recall two events that strike me. Is we had to go through this particular canal strait that went to because we were going to the, well, I guess it'd be the western side of Hokkaido, but the current through there was like 12 miles per hour, or 12 knots, excuse me, and we could only do, or maybe it was 10 and we could only do 12, I forget, or 12 or 14, but that really is not the case. But we could just barely, we could add enough power that we moved going through there like at 2 miles per hour, which felt like you were standing still. But anyhow, we took it off, and we had left the Philippines in like 90-degree weather, and here it was about 14 inches of snow on the ground, and it was cold. And so I remember those two things. And following that, we did another trip down to we went, because I remember going into Yokohama, and amazingly, I had never run into anyone during that period of time that from my hometown or anybody I knew, but I was on the docks at Yokohama, and I saw this guy walking away, sailor, and he was a high school, and he was the only guy in the world I ever seen walk the way he did, and I knew who it was just from his walk. But anyhow, we greeted each other and talked a while and had a little fun. But Then we went to Tokyo, took the troop train up to Tokyo, and I remember all the people. Everybody was trying to go somewhere, and they just hordes of people, and you could see for miles that there was no buildings or anything. It had all been bombed or burned out, and there'd be maybe one building standing of a concrete structure of some kind of that nature. But I remember the people trying to get a grab to get on the train, and they had sticks and they'd knock them off. But everywhere was trying to go somewhere, and a lot of devastation in Japan from the bombing that had preceded. And of course, the atomic bomb is probably the reason a lot of us are still here. So following that, we did. One thing I left out that during it that is very memorable is the huge typhoon that we went through while I was, it was in 1945, and I don't remember exactly what month or anything. All I remember is the storm. That we were caught in, we were in Okinawa. And Okinawa, we left and we were flagship and took a group of ships out to get away, try to get away from the storm. And we hit it about midnight, and we had 90-foot waves. And one event that sticks in my mind, because I can see his face today, was the commander of the flight, not our captain, but who commanded the whole fleet, the flotilla, they would call it, that we were in. Anyhow, I was on the bridge and took a message from one of our ships. Took a long time to get because the ships would disappear. The waves were so high and the seas so rough. And I took a message. He said, request permission to man over. We have a man overboard. Request permission to try and rescue. And I remember I gave the message to him, and I can remember the look on his face. It seemed like it was a long time, but it was only seconds. We said, request denied. And so I sent back the message, request denied. And a short time later, he said to me, he said, signal him and call him and tell him to give me the name and rank of the man overboard. And so I did. And wasn't long, some time later, because they had to do a complete check, they sent back, must have been an object that went overboard, no one missing. And I'll never forget the look on his face of relief versus the look of pain in making the decision that they would not try to save someone. So those are some of the things that stick in your mind, and from there we retain to two other things that happened during this period of time I think that influences me today. Is that one time we had a guy that was on the 20 millimeter gun. That's a pretty good size anti-aircraft weapon is what it is. And they had guards so that you couldn't shoot yourself. In other words, the guard was a metal guard around made of, maybe 1-inch pipe that would, when the gun barrel hit that, he knew you couldn't, it would keep it from hitting any part of the ship. But he lost his mind, and as a result, he broke that guardrail and just started shooting the heck out of all of us. And finally I crawled and got to him, and it's hard to understand the strength in someone that is completely gone. It took all, and I was pretty good shape at that time. Did a little boxing. I was 182 pounds, and that's when I was in prime shape because I could always feel it. When I got to 182 pounds, I knew it. I didn't have to get on the scales or anything. But anyhow, it took all my strength to pry his fingers off of the trigger. And, of course, he ran out of ammunition after a while because it spit it up pretty fast, but it sticks in my mind. And the other one was one of our guys was on a mission to Okinawa, and that was a horrible, horrible experience. And Okinawa was a bad situation where the people wouldn't surrender, and they were in caves, and they'd use flamethrowers. And see, we were trained, he was in small boats like myself, and we were trained that if you lost your boat, you went with the troops. You just didn't say, well, my job's over or anything, but you took off with the troops. And he was telling about that you'd walk into the caves, and here would be this whole family, maybe a mother with a baby in her arms, and whatever position they were in when that flame hit them, they were frozen there, just like a steak that you cook a piece of meat or something. Anyhow, he came back, and he was gone for 30 days. When he left, his hair was just black as coal. When he came back, it was white as snow. But we were playing cards one night, and all at once he started talking about his mother and father in a rhythmic motion, and I looked up and I saw his eyes, and I knew he'd gone. And to this day, I don't like to watch movies or anything whereby people are insane, because it affects me. So that is the reason. And one other instance that I did leave out that's very important to me is that one night during the Pacific, I was in the Pacific somewhere, I don't remember where, I wouldn't know exactly where I was, but we were at sea. And it was raining awfully hard. It wasn't the storm I talked about, but it was raining very hard. And here I was, just within 1 foot of me through the conning tower. There were the officers inside, and I was outside. And the only difference between me and them was the fact that they had a college education and I did not. And I resolved that night that if I made it and got back, that I was going to go to college and get a college degree. And that did come to pass. But that's something that I thought I should mention. And then June the 6th, 1946, I left the United States Navy and returned home and to the family. I guess there's one thing I should tell you on the way back. It was an experience, because it's the greatest thing ever happened to me, in fact, that when we got back in the States, Mother and I had a code that if I got back and wanted a leave, that she would send me a wire that my grandmother was sick. Well, my grandmother was sick all my life, but she sent me the wire when I got back to the States, and had told her we were back. And this was in March of 1946. And so she sent the wire, and I hitched a ride with the Flying Tigers. They had just started an airline at that time, in cargo, and on an old C-47. But I hitched a ride back to St. Louis and came home on leave, and that's when Eva and I got married. When I was only there for a few days, and I had to go back, and I was in the Long Beach Naval Hospital had to have some repair work done. And then I was sent to Great Lakes and was released on June 6, 1946. Now we're back. It's now June 6, 1946, and I've returned from the Navy. I was discharged on June the 6th, and even now we've been married for almost 3 months. And so we moved into, come home and we moved into our first apartment. It was, I don't remember a whole lot about it. She would remember it better. But I remembered it was our home and our nest. And so we were in there for until fall. And that summer, I worked for my father in construction. He got me a job, and I don't remember how much I was paid. It wasn't a whole lot, but it was money, and we had to have it. And I remember one incident. We'd traveled back, and we were working in Lexington, which is about 20, 25 miles away, and I traveled over back and forth with him, and the other men, in a truck. Well, my dad and the driver and myself were in the cab, and we had men on the back, and I forget how many, but there was more than one. Anyhow, one of the people on there was my cousin, Paul Shelton, and we were in an accident in a car. So he swerved, missed the car, and he ran over the embankment, and we started turning over. Well, when you're turning over in a car, a truck, it seems like you do it so slowly. But anyhow, we turned over, and we crawled out the side of the window. And my cousin, I looked up, he ran about 100 yards as fast as anybody could. Then he dropped to the ground, and he said, "I'm hurt, I can't move." And I said, "The heck you can't move? You just ran 100 yards in record time." And he couldn't believe it. He had run, but I suppose it was because he had the fear that the truck was going to hit him, and that's what caused him to do that. But anyhow, it was laughable, and it wasn't laughable. So for the summer, I worked at that job, and then in September, I enrolled in Kentucky Wesleyan College, and they had a veterans education program, and so I got in that, and we moved into what they called a veterans village. It was named Reynolds Village after that, and we were organized. We had mayors and councilmen and so forth, and I was elected fire chief. And let me tell you why I was elected fire chief, which is a funny story, I think, is that we had pot-bellied stoves to heat the Quonset hut. It was about, I'd say it was about 50 feet long, but there were two apartments. It was split down the middle, and we had sat, and each of us had a pot-bellied stove to heat the place, and it was fueled with coal. Well, one day I came in and I lifted the lid to see if it was still fire in there, and it exploded. All that gases had built up, and it came out and singed my hair, and I had a fuzzy-like sweater on, and it singed all that sweater, and they said, "Well, now Jay should be the fire chief." And it was because of that. And later on, I became mayor of the little village. We had like 26 units, so it'd be about 50. I guess it was 13 units with 26 families. That's the way it was. So that was interesting. It was an interesting time. Happy times. Not many of us had any money, but evening sessions, I remember these, and I have a real fond memories of this. We would all get our chair out of the house or something, come out and sit in a circle, and we'd take up subjects and discuss them, and and debate over them, and sometimes you'd take a topic that you really didn't believe in, but you would defend it. And I found those very enjoyable times and times that I remember. And I had a lot of part-time jobs. I went back to driving the school bus. As you'll recall earlier, I drove a school bus while I was in the last 2 years I was in high school. And so I got my school bus driving job back, and that was one of them. Then I worked part-time at a department store, and had a good friend. In fact, he married my brother-in-law, which is Mary Ruth's husband. He married Mary Ruth's husband's sister, so we had a kind of relation from that direction. But his name was Charles Bruce. Remember two things about Charlie. He ran the shoe department in the department store that I worked in. And one time this lady came in, and it wasn't all that big a store. Well, it was pretty good size, but you was aware of what was going on in the store. Anyhow, this lady came in, and she was trying on a pair of shoes. And amazingly, for some reason, or he used to say that people would ask for a size of shoe when it would no way on earth it was going to fit. It was always a size or two smaller. Anyhow, he's pushing on the back of the heel trying to get the shoe on her, and his hand slipped and he popped her right on the thigh. You could hear the slap as it moved in all over the store. And Charlie was a very gentle type of man, and the blood just rushed up to his face. He's red as a beet, but this woman was laughing about it. But we always kidded Charlie about that. And another thing in class one time, but I remember this, we were discussing honesty and so forth. And he said, let me give you an example. Most of you know I don't have much money, never had much money, but someday I hope to. And I'm in a place of business, and I go in and there's $5 on the table, and I can take that $5, and the chances are no one would ever know that I took it. He said I wouldn't even think about it, or $10 or $20 or $100. But let's say that it was $100,000. I remember $100,000 back then would be equivalent to millions now. And he said I could take that and I could get away from it. He said, you know, I don't know what I would do. And it's kind of something that's stuck in my mind throughout lifetime, that we can be put into situations where maybe we wouldn't know what we would do. In other words, we would be tempted. And but it's a kind of something that's stuck in my mind, and I've thought about it a lot when you talk about serious subjects, so forth, that possibly we all could be tempted at one time or another. But I worked at the department store, and the other jobs I had while in college, one time Bill Dameron was one of my buddies, and Bill and I, one summer, we took on some jobs, and we were going to refurbish this house for a doctor. In other words, we painted the outside of it and wallpapered the inside. But Bill's father had a wallpapering business or something, so he knew how to do that. And I remember we would put that wallpaper on and paint, and we had a little business going, so we just conjured up that if we went to business people, that we could have night jobs. Then we told them, look, you're busy in the daytime, and if you have to paint, then you kind of have to almost close down. But if you will let us paint your inside of your building or your shop or whatever it is, we'll do it of a night when nobody's around, and therefore you'll never have to close down. So we got several little jobs that way and made a little money. And then I was the went to work for a drive-in theater as a parker. And we'd park the cars as the cars drove in, tell them where to line them up and park them, and I became the assistant manager. And so I would hire the parkers, so I didn't have a car, so I always hired somebody from our little village that had a car that could get us back and forth to work. And but that was fun. That only lasted for summer months, of course, because in the winter it was too cold and to stay open. But I remember I would sometimes bring all that money home, and all that money might be $200 or $300, but that was a lot of money back then, and I'd throw it under the bed and be concerned about it until I got to the bank or turned it in. Then my junior year, I remember I did some work in the summer for my father. Father got me a job on a construction job, and it was digging ditches. And I remember my classmates passing by and said, "Here you are, a junior in college, and you're digging ditches." And I said, "Well, you do whatever you have to do in order to get money." And I remember another thing in my college years, about my sophomore year, I had a professor by the name of Piles, P-Y-L-E-S, Dr. Piles, and he was my advisor. And so I went to him and I said, "Doctor, when I first came here, I thought I was pretty knowledgeable and so forth, but I said, the longer I stay here, the dumber I feel." And he said to me, he said, "Son, you're getting an education." He said, "The more you learn, the more you realize what you don't know." And that's something that's always stuck with me, that really when you open a door in life, you see things that, well, I never realized that before, and it's even happening to me at 75. So it's a lifetime experience, but I always remember that conversation that I had with him. And so I had many jobs while I was in college, and and I remember I did my practice teaching. I was going to be a teacher. That was my goal when I started to college. And so I was doing practice teaching one time, and I minored in business. And so I was hoping that maybe I could even teach in the business in high school. And because it generally paid a little bit more than the history teachers and so forth. So anyhow, I was doing my time, and I had to teach shorthand, and I didn't take shorthand. I couldn't read shorthand. And this is how I did it. I taught the students. I'd take my best students, and I'd say, "Okay, now today you're in charge." And so you'd have them do something, and I'd say, "Now, is that correct?" And she or he would say, "Yes, it is." And I'd say, "Class, how about that? Is everything correct on there?" And so we got through, and they never knew I couldn't read or take shorthand during that period of time. And I remember one lad, he was kind of a funny guy, always in one of the classes mouthing off and so forth. And I knew his mother. I worked with her and they were like most people at that time, they didn't have much, and life was a struggle. And I remember sitting down with him and telling him what I thought of his mother and so forth, and that I told him, I said, "I like smart people, but I don't like smart Alex." And I said, "Your mother works awfully hard for your family, and the best thing you could do for her is to make good grades and so forth and so on." Never had any more problems with him after we had that little chat. And but that's just a couple things that I remember there. As I said, I was planning to be a teacher, and that year I was offered. We were getting late in my period, so it was time for me to start looking for a job, and I applied for a job I was going to coach and teach business, which is supposed to pay a little more, at Silver Springs, Kentucky, at the rate of $1,700 per year. Well, as it happened, man came by, said he got my name, and he was looking for who they thought was the most ambitious young man that they knew, and my name had come up twice. And he wanted to talk to me. He said he was in the insurance business. And he said his average man made $5,000 per year, and that he had an opening and was interested in anyhow. I said to him, I can do anything the average man does, provided I get the same training. He assured me we'd get the training, and that's when we got serious about going into the insurance business. But a couple of things I wanted to tell you about that I did while I was in college. My freshman year, or at the end of my freshman year, in June or April the 30th of 1947, my first child was born, Janet. And Janet was certainly a blessing, and we have so many good memories of that time because when she was a baby and those next almost 3 years, the girls from a dormitory would come down and get her and take her to the dormitory, and a couple of stories I want to tell you about her at that time is that one time when she was about 2, she was missing and run off, and we found her, and there was a little grocery store that we would go and get our groceries from about, I'd say maybe a half a mile away or something like that. And when I'd go to the grocery, or Eva would go to the grocery, she'd want to go along, and she'd tag along, and so she had went to that grocery by herself. And in fact, they called and told us that she was there. So anyhow, she had to be disciplined about that. And so but it was good years, and also that first year that I was in college, when I got out of the Navy, I weighed 180 pounds, and I started losing weight. And I went down to 139 pounds, and that's pretty bony on a 6 foot 1 inch frame. And so I went to the Veterans hospital and told them anyhow. They examined me, and no, I went to my doctor. That's what it was. I hadn't gone to at that point, and they examined me, and they told me, well, I think it maybe your tonsils. So I went to the Veterans Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, and for Christmas holiday, and had my tonsils taken out. And I sat up in the chair. He only gave me Novocaine, I guess it was, in the throat, and he cut them out with me conscious. I remember this doctor saying to me, well, don't worry about swallowing a little blood. It's not going to hurt you. I'm gagging, going, as he's cutting them. But anyhow, today that would be barbarious for someone to take your tonsils out without even putting you to sleep. But anyhow, it didn't work. I continued to lose weight. So I finally went to the Veterans Hospital and sat down and talked to a doctor, and he said, well, where did you serve? And I told him about the South Pacific and the Philippines, and he said, I think I know what it is. And so they took a test, a stool, and they found out that I had an amoeba that I had picked up over there, and so that was what it was. And he said, take these pills. I mean, for 2 weeks, and if ever reoccurs, you can take them again. But that cleared it up in no time at all, and I started gaining weight back and was back to somewhat normal. But those are some of the things. And now, I graduated or finished in January of 1950, and we moved to Lancaster, Kentucky. We hadn't owned a car in all this time. If we wanted to go somewhere, we'd walk. You could walk downtown to a movie, and walk wherever you wanted to go. And I bought a 1937 Plymouth Coupe. That was boy, I was proud of that car. It was my first one. And in this job, you were expected to wear a coat and tie and a hat. I don't know why we wore hats, but they requested it now. But they thought everybody should wear a hat, and so and we moved into an old colonial home that had 2 apartments, and the owner lived upstairs. They had aged, and that was they converted the downstairs. It was a big home, with the colonial look, brick, and the police chief lived in one apartment, and Eva and I lived in the other one. And in the job that I started doing, I remembered, as you recall back, I mentioned the fact that I did a little boxing while I was in the Navy, and used to get in with some guys, and they were trying to beat you up. But I always had to get up nerve or something to go up and knock on the door and say, "My name's Jay Foley, and I have no way of knowing whether my services can be of value and interest to you, but I do have an idea that might be helpful. May I come in?" And that was kind of the approach I was taught, and I did quite well at it. I sold a lot of insurance, but in fact, I sold the first $100,000 policy that had ever been sold in that office that I was in, and that was a big deal back then, because mostly we sold $200-300 policies, $500 policies. And I remember one time I was out canvassing, and that was when you went door to door. I knocked on this door, and it opened. I said, "My name's Jay Foley," and this guy says, "My name's Jay Foley." And I thought he was mimicking me, and it turned out his name was Jay Foley. And so we had a nice chat, no relation that we could come to a conclusion on. But while we lived there, a couple things about Janet that I recall. And one time she was missing, and the neighbors all liked her, and she'd go visit them and so forth. She was missing for a little while, and Eva went looking for her, and there was a lot of cars at one house and a big party going on. They were having dinner, and she walked in, and there they had Janet sitting at the table. She was in her, and when Eva walked in, she jumped up and lifted her dress and said, "Look, Mama, I don't have any pants on." And Eva talks about how embarrassed she was and everything, and of course the neighbors but that's a story on her. Then another time when we took her to a movie, and now the movie, it's a Western. This is the only thing I remember of, and these guys were knocking each other around, and I remember Janet saying, this little voice in this theater sounding out, says, "Mama, make those men quit fighting." And of course the crowd kind of roared, but that's a couple of memories of Janet. Would have been about 4 years old at that time. And I had one section that I worked in, I thought it was of interest. It was called, there's an area where when I crossed, I had to drive through the creek to get on the other side, dirt road, or gravel road, I should say. And I determined I didn't have any clients over there, so I determined I was going to go over there and try to get some. And so I tried to knock on doors, and I'd see people lift the shade and look out, and nobody would come to the door. And anyhow, I didn't give up, so I was down there one day working, and my manager was with me. Kyle Cox was his name. And Kyle and I were driving along, and this little boy came running by and said, "There's a boy that just drowned down here." And I said, "Kyle, I had a little training in resuscitation while I was in the Navy. Maybe if we went down, there's something I can do. Anyhow, I went down, volunteered my service, got the little lad, and he was about 2 years old. And I put him on a woman, get me a table or something. She got an ironing board, and I laid the lad on the ironing board and worked with him. And I told the people, I said, somebody go call the Berea, Kentucky Fire Department, which is only about 8 miles away or something like that. No one ever did. This was a very backward group of people. Death was, to them, was, I don't know how to explain it. They didn't understand. You would class them as backward today. But anyhow, they didn't. I got him going at one time, but I couldn't save him. But anyhow, I tried. And he had drowned in about a foot of water, had tripped and fell in a little stream that was going by, and he'd evidently breathed in water and being a baby and didn't know any difference. But anyhow. But after that, the reason I tell this story, that after that, when I would go down there and I'd knock on the door, somebody would open the door and say, "You're the young man that worked on the family name of the boy." And I'd say, "Yes, ma'am," or "Yes, sir." And they'd say, "Come in." And I did quite a bit of business down there. Another story I wanted to tell you about. In fact, they would always say, "Now you're going to have lunch or dinner." See, they didn't. Dinner was at lunchtime in farming communities, and you had supper before going in the afternoon, or what we now call dinner. And this particular day, they caught me where I couldn't say, "Well, now I'm too busy now," and so forth. And so I remember sitting down at the table, and the flies, and I kind of don't like flies, and to put it mildly. And it was on the food, but anyhow, I sat down, and it didn't taste that bad, but they'd said, "How'd you like that?" "Oh, that was good. Here, have some more." Anyhow, after I left, I remember stopping the car and getting rid of it. But they were good people, basically. And I had one lady that I sold an insurance policy to her, and then a few months later, I went by and I said, "Where's Miss Bessie?" And they said, "Oh, she's not here. She's down. She's sick." And she left word that she wanted to see you if you came back, because I go in that area every week. Well, I went back and down, and she was in bed, and she was ill. You could see that. And I remember all these people sitting around like you would do. But anyhow, she said, "Honey, I want to pay my insurance." And she fumbled in her gown, and I could see she had quite a bit of money there, bills. And so anyhow, after I left there, I got concerned, and I told her, "You need to go to a hospital. We need to get you to a doctor." "Oh, we can't afford that," and so forth. So it bothered me, and on the way home that evening, I stopped at I was in the Lions Club there, and one of the judge was a member, and I stopped and told him about it, and he said, "What family did you say that she was with?" And I told him. He said, "We better get her out of there." And so he called the ambulance, and we all three went down with the driver, and he and I went down, and we picked her up and took her to the hospital. And when we got to the hospital, the nurse said, "Well, we're going to have to change you. Take your gown off and put one of our gowns on." And she said, "Oh, no, can't do that." And they said, "Well, you got to. That's our rule." And she said, "Well, if y'all let me talk to Mr. Foley just for a minute," she said, "then I'll do it." So when they went out and closed the door, she said, "Honey, I've got a lot of money on me." And she said, "I want you to take it, because they'll take it." And I said, "No, I won't take it, but I'll tell you what I will do. I'll make them count. We'll count it right here before me. And they'll give us a receipt for it, and I'll keep the receipt for you." And she said, "Okay, if you think I should do that." And so I did, and they did, and it was about $300, as I recall. But these bills had turned yellow. She had had them so long. And, of course, $300 was pretty good sum of money in 1950 to a lot of families. And but anyhow, she said, I would like for you to call my son. He's in Illinois, and tell him that I want to see him. And I kind of figured that she had some. She had owned a store, and I figured maybe she had some money hid away somewhere or something. But she says it's very important that I talk to him. And so I did. I went home at night and I called him and told him. He said, "Well, I can't come. I don't." He gave me several reasons, but I said, "Well, the only thing I can tell you, fella, that if it was my mother, I would crawl on my hands and knees to get there, if she wanted." And but anyhow, he didn't come, and she died. And so the judge asked me. He said, "Well, she had a little insurance that would pay for her burial," and he said, "And the money, other money." He said, "Okay, I'm appointing you administrator." She had no relatives, other relatives in that. So I arranged for the funeral, and I remember we had the funeral in a little church that they didn't have wood floors. It was dirt floors, and logs had been hewed out to sit on. And but anyhow, in preparing for the funeral, I had $5 left over after I'd paid for the funeral, and there was $5, and I didn't want to be left. So I went to the florist and I said, "What kind of wreath can you give me for $5? And he said, "Jay, we don't have a $5 wreath." And I gave him, and then I explained to him. Well, he said, "Why $5? And I explained to him. He said, "Oh, we got a nice one." So we got a nice flower. But after that, after the funeral and the burial and everything had been taken out, and I reported back to the judge that everything had been used, I got this letter from from her son. He said, "I think my mother had a lot of money and I want it, and I hold you responsible for it." And so I went to the judge, and I wrote to the guy what I had told him over the phone, that what happened. I told him exactly how the money had been spent and everything, and but I explained to him everything had been used. But I told him in that letter, I said, "I don't think much of you. And again, I restate to you that if it were my mother, I would have crawled from Illinois if it had been necessary to see her." And but I never heard from him again. But it's an experience that I remember. So in 1950, the latter part of this was 1950. In 1951, I was promoted to what they call assistant manager and transferred back to Winchester, Kentucky. And so this was a promotion for me, and I had 5 agents under me, 5 or 6. I don't recall exactly, but anyhow, it was about that. And I'd have to travel to up to several counties. I'm trying to think of the name, but anyhow, I was allowed, if I had to stay overnight, I was allowed $6 per day. That was for your room, that was for your food, and but you could get breakfast for about 25 cents or 35 cents, eggs, and stayed in a little inn, and it seemed like the room was $3 a night. But anyhow, I get by on this. The $6 did cover my expenses, but I think in terms of today, and that $6 wouldn't have gone very far. And a couple of experiences during that period of time. Of course, Marv was born, R.J., and I had a son. Now I had a daughter, Janet, and Marv, and it was a happy time for us. And we lived on French Avenue, was the name of the street there. And some of the memorable experiences from this period in time. One day I was canvassing knocking on doors with one of my agents, and I came across a lady that she said, "Sir, I wish I'd have known you a long time ago, but we had insurance with your company, but my husband just died a few weeks ago." And she said, "We don't have any money to buy insurance." She said, in fact, we had quit paying on it when he died. And I said, "You mean you didn't get anything?" She said, "No." I said, "Do you have any records of what you had and so forth? Because the automatic benefit on lapsed insurance is extended insurance." And so I found out that he had a $500 policy and that it was on extended insurance. And so I called the office and they got the money to him immediately. She had told me, "I don't even have money to buy food for tomorrow." And so anyhow, we expedited the money, and I was able to take $500 to her, and I'll always remember. She had several children, and the one light bulb was hanging down from the wall, and those kids were sitting around the room when I delivered that. And I felt good about what I did about selling insurance and so forth. And then another time I was working, and generally our work day to me was 8 o'clock in the morning till about 9 at night, because you caught people who worked. You'd have to see them after they got home from work. And this one night, I remember I had talked to this guy, and I sold him. He said, "Well, I'll take it." And I remembered a big black dog laying beside him. And this dog would have weighed about 60 or 70 pounds. He was big, good size. And so I filled out the application. I raised up and walked over, and just as I handed the man the pen, I saw this black flash, and the dog hit me in the chest, and I fell to the floor, and I could see his mouth, fangs open, coming at me. And this man hollered some command, and the dog backed off immediately. But he said, "Oh my gosh, I forgot to turn." He had this dog trained. They had to say a word when everything was all right. And he hadn't. And when I touched him, he said, "Anybody touch me, the dog attacks." But boy, I was white as a sheet. And you talk about being scared. But anyhow, it was another event in my life that I haven't forgot. And one time I was in this house selling shoes, or selling insurance, and little 1 or 2 year old kept fooling with my foot, but I'm talking at him, so I don't pay any attention to him. After I finally looked down, he had taken shoe polish, or not nail polish, and had painted my shoes red. And anyhow, it wiped off. I never did get all of it off, but every now and then when I'd shine those shoes, I'd see a little red speck, and I'd think about that. But you put up with a lot to make a sale. But so now it's 1953, and a company asked me to go to Gadsden. I moved to Gadsden, Alabama on a special assignment that they had trouble there, and they felt like I could solve the problem. And I did, and I might say I'm the only person that ever worked there that still worked for the company after they left, that they hadn't had much success rate. But we enjoyed our stay in Gadsden. I was a deacon in the church, and a couple of little incidents about Marv while we were there. One Sunday I was getting ready for church, and I was tying my tie, and I smoked then. And I had laid a cigarette down in the ashtray, and I turned around. Now, this is 1953, 54, I guess, or 53 when we moved there. It was sometime during that period, would have been 53 or 54, so he'd have been 2 or possibly 3 years old at the most, and I heard him coughing, and I turned around, and that 2-year-old or 3-year-old, whatever it was, had a cigarette in his hand like I held him, and he was puffing, had taken a puff on that cigarette. And it makes me understand how people, what you do in life, your children will mimic you. And another Sunday, it was Easter Sunday. The reason we remember this Easter, everybody always dressed up on Easter. The women dressed up, they wore their hats, they had a bouquet of flowers and so forth. And so Eva had Janet and Marv all dressed up, and he got in his Easter basket, and he got a hold of some black jelly beans. Well, he had that black jelly beans over his little white shirt, and I can see him now in his bow tie and so forth. And it was all over his face, and she had to redo him before we went to church. And then another experience that I recall with Janet is Eva's parents were down to visit us, and they were there, and Janet was sick, so I went up with her bedrooms were upstairs, went upstairs with her, and I was trying to take care of her. She was running a temperature and ill, and so she was I'd laid her on my chest and was patting her back and trying to get her to go to sleep. And she vomited, and she vomited right in my face. And I remember it getting in my eyes. And now, well, you talk about something that stings. But so we got me and her cleaned up. But I was about half asleep myself when it happened. So it's a memory that you remember, and we survived it, and we still love each other just as much. Now it's and a couple of events, things that happened there that are things that you remember for a lifetime. One is I was called into the IRS for a tax audit, and I had to go to Birmingham, Alabama, and to do it, and they figured up that I had charged off expenses of doing business, which is car and so forth, and this guy claimed that I wasn't entitled to the deduction, and he was going to charge me, I was going to have to pay $300. And I said, well, that's just not right. We're in his office. And he said to me, he said, sir, if you go to court, you'll beat us. You won't have to pay it. But you'll spend more on a lawyer than you will us, and so, why not? And I said, would you say that to someone present? He said, well, of course not. And I was so angry, I wanted to strike him. And since then, I've always felt like, as far as taxes are concerned, I'll never pay a tax I don't have to. And but that's something that stuck in my mind. And we went to buy a new car, and I think this is an interesting story. And I took Eva along with me, and this was in the little town next to Gadsden. And I told Eva, I said, now no matter what he says, Eva, you say, Jay, we can't afford it. So we saw the car that we'd like to have. It was a Buick 4-door, and we liked it. And so I said, how much is it going to cost? And he said, well, with all with white sidewalls. That's when you purchased a car. You bought everything separate. The radio, we didn't have air conditioning to mount anything in cars then, but everything that was on there was separate. And so seat covers or whatever. But anyhow, so he put it down, and he said, that'll be X, I don't remember the amount of dollars, but He said, be that much. And Eva said, Jay, we can't afford it. And I said, well, if he put the white sidewalls on, gave a set, he'd say, would you do that? And he'd say, yeah, I'll do that. And she'd say, Jay, we can't afford it. Anyhow, we took everything off, all the extras off. And she was still saying, Jay, we can't afford it, but we got everything, all the extras free. We got it down. But we bought the car. And so we'd signed up and everything, and we were ready to go, and he said, sir, would you do me one favor before you leave? And I said, yeah. He said, would you make me a promise that the next time you want to buy a car, that you go somewhere else? So that has always stuck in my mind. And from Gadsden, Alabama. And one other little incident like this that I remember so often, that I was in my office one day, and I could hear, office walls were thin, you could hear the company next door talking and what they were saying, and it was spitting snow. Every now and then you'd see a snowflake come down, which is unusual in Alabama, but yeah, I heard this one fellow say, they don't expect people to work in weather like this, do they? And since my travails and all the states I've lived in and everything, and traveling over icy roads and snow, I've often thought of that statement. And one other thing there that comes to mind is that I was in this garage one day. I was having something done to the car, and I remember a black fellow walked in. And somebody said, I forget what his name was, Sam, or let's say it was Sam. He said, Sam, where in the world have you been? Said, I haven't seen you in ages. He said, oh, don't you know I've been living up in Detroit? And he said, there, and he said, work for Ford Motor Company. And he said, well, what in the world are you doing back down here? He said, well, things is good. You make good money up there. But he said, Sam got sick up there, and nobody comes to see him. He said, down here, and Sam gets sick, said, people come and see how you're doing, anything he can do for you. And he said, I kind of like that better. And I thought, well, that was an interesting little story. And so, but now, it's 1954, or early 55, I can't remember exactly when, but we moved back, I was promoted. I became a consultant, and as I said, I was the first man that ever went to work in Gadsden, was transferred to Gadsden, Alabama, stayed with the company, and when they left there. And we moved to Louisville in an apartment, and it's a training consultant, and this had meant Eva had moved. No, that's when next move we made. But in this job that I had now, briefly cover some of the things, I traveled as a training, I was called a training consultant, so I'd go to various cities and so forth and help train agents and so forth, and managers and assistant managers. And so during this period of time, Eva moved. Now this is two moves. She would always move, and I would be sent ahead and everything. And so this was the third, we moved over to New Albany, Indiana, and this was the third move she had made this year, and she was 5 months pregnant with Mary Susan. And I was in Charleston, West Virginia, when she moved across this house in New Albany. And the first night there, it's raining hard, and she hears a hissing sound, and she opens the basement door, and there's fire dancing on the water. And what had happened, the water heater was down there, and so the gas it was a gas water heater, and so the gas was rising on the water. Anyhow, she had to bundle up Janet and Marv, and again, she's 5 months pregnant, and I'm in Charleston, West Virginia, working, and but on June the 6th, early morning, she woke me up and she said, "We've got to go to the hospital." And so we raced across. She was going to be born in a hospital in Louisville, Kentucky. And so I ran through the town, raced through the town, driving, running red lights and everything. And we get to the hospital, and I get in, and I walk in, and there's a fellow there. He's got a beard, and he's been there for a couple of days. And I remember I had just sat down, and the nurse came in, and he jumped up. He thought it was his with a baby. And he said, she walked over to me and said, "Sir, you're the father of a baby girl." And he said, "I can't believe this. I've been here for 2 days, and you walk in, and you've got your baby." But anyhow, Mama being Eva, Grandma, wasn't in the hospital very long before she came along. But it was a great time, and this was the beginning of a beautiful lady that she is today. And often I didn't realize then, and only realized in recent years, what wonderful children that I have, and the many experiences that we would have. Because until they're grown, do you really realize what wonderful, caring, compassionate people that we have. Now, that's when she was in the hospital that I told her we were moving to Springfield, Ohio, that I had gotten a promotion. Now I was going to be manager of a district. But I'll have to tell you about this experience so briefly anyhow. When I went in for this promotion, they told me that this is what I got, and I said, "Well, I've got to be guaranteed something." I moved, and no, you'll be guaranteed what the contracts call for. And I said, "Well, I don't think I want the job." He said, "Well, you don't have any choice. You either do that or you're going to be transferred to Newport, Kentucky back as an assistant manager." And I said, "No, I have another choice." And they said, "No, you don't." I said, "Well, but I do." They said, "Well, what is it?" And I said, "I can quit." And I just quit. So I walked out of the office. This was the vice president's office we were in. And my assistant, he was the vice president also. This was a big vice president. And the other vice president, he followed me out of the office, and he said, "Jay, go walk around the block a while and think." And I said, "Okay." He said, "Come back in 20 minutes or whatever it was." So I came back, and they adjusted somewhat and made the guarantee that I'd asked for a period of time until I could build it up. And so we moved to Springfield, Ohio. And we moved into a kind of a California-style home. They had it up for sale, but I told them I wasn't going to rent it if they were going to keep it for sale, but I would rent it for a period of time if they took it off the market, and they agreed, and we moved in. We hadn't been there very long till they put the for sale sign back up, and that's when I knew it wouldn't be long before winter in school was coming on, and Janet was in school at that time, and I don't remember whether Marv went to kindergarten or not, but anyhow, they were getting up the age, and so we moved, and again to Cecil Street in Springfield, Ohio, which and we lived there, and a couple of memorable experiences that I have from there is that's where I first started playing golf, and I belonged to the men's golf club at Snyder Park, and I'd play there and enjoyed it very much. And in fact, I was in the JCs also there, and I was head of the young men, these are high school people, golf we ran tournaments, sponsored them in the state tournament and so forth. And we took a couple of lads to, we being Tom, can't think of his last name now, Tom and I were in charge of it, and we took the golf team, JC Golf, or for Springfield, Ohio golf team, to Toledo, Ohio to participate. Well, the interesting point that I'm making about that, there was a young fat boy there that he just walked away with the tournament. And it turned out his name was Jack Nicklaus. And that was when Jack Nicklaus was a high school student, and today he's who he is. But I remember seeing him play golf when he was just a young fat student, and he was a heavy-set boy. And I used to had to have I was having some pain, and the doctor wanted to do a cystoscopy on me to see if I had kidney stones and so forth. And I had to go into the hospital in the hospital operating room for it to be performed, and they had to give me Demerol to put me under. And the doctor, he was a friend of mine, he kidded me a lot. He said, "Boy, if I could have recorded this, I knew your family history. You talked it makes you talk." After it was over, everything was okay, but they had to put me in. I was still under the influence, so to speak, and so they put me in the room. They put me in the room with a fella by the name that had a heart attack. And I was in the room, and I looked over at him, and I said, "Did you ever feel like hollering?" Because I was drunk on this Demerol, you know. And you talk a lot, they say. And so I said, "You ever feel like hollering?" And he said, "Yeah, oh yeah, I felt that way many times." And I went, "Yahoo!" real loud, screamed, and nurses come pouring into the room. Anyhow, I carried on so much that they had to move the guy. He was laughing so much that they was afraid he was going to have another heart attack. But anyhow, when I come to myself, and I realized that what I had done, because you could remember it, but and I was embarrassed, so I got up and put my clothes on and slipped out of the hospital. And when I got home, I called back, and they said, "Where are you? You have to check out." And I said, "No, I've checked out already. I'm home." But another memorable experience. Then we would, each year, some friends of mine and we'd go to Canada for a week's fishing trip. And we had these Indians as guides, same ones over every year. That I was there for 3 years, we did it. And one of the guys that would go with us, he was manager of Sears Roebuck men's department. And during the year, he would, if they had some old shirts that got spotted or something, clothes that we would wear fishing, and you needed heavy clothes, wool clothes, he would call us and say, "I'm going to put it on sale now if you'd like to buy this to take to Canada." And what we'd do is to buy those things, and we would give, before we left, these Indians were so poor, we would give them our clothes afterwards. And I remember when you'd go, the Indian look at the shirt you had on, nice, knowing he was going to get it on the other end. And one other experience that I had there was memorable, to say the least, was that we would shoot there could only be 2 men in the boat, plus when you were shooting the falls, so to speak. You'd have to go down the rapids to where we were, but whoever else was in the boat would get out and walk around. Well, this particular night, I said, "Well, all you'd have is a flashlight." And there was a little trail there. I said, "I'll do the walking around." And so I got out of the boat, and I started down, and I got lost. Somehow I made the wrong turn, and I walked finally came to just a brick, not a brick wall, but a stone cliff. And I realized I was lost. Well, I sat down, and I said, "I'll just wait, and they'll find me." because to be a guide, if they ever lost anyone, they watched you like a hawk because they would take their license away from them, and that was their livelihood. So I'm waiting, and I got to thinking, that day before we'd seen some bears out there playing on that little rocky place. And I got thinking, what am I going to do if a bear comes up? But anyhow, didn't let my imagination run away from it too much, I guess, because it wasn't long I heard them hollering, and by shining the light in the air and so forth, they found me. And so I remember that experience with that. Now, we had enjoyable time in Springfield, and I remember Janet was in school, and Marv, a university student or something, would come and sit with him. And and I recall this experience. I did some pheasant hunting there, and I would always, when I was hunting, I'd take the feathers back to Marv, the tail feathers. And one day in the snow, I'd taken Randy, the bird dog I'd bought was named Randy, and I took Randy, and we were walking along, and I saw these feathers sticking out of the snow, so I reached down just subconsciously and picked them up, grabbed them, and when I grabbed them, I realized there was something live on the end of them. It was a cock pheasant. Oh, he was squawking, and he took off, and old Randy was right behind me, and he heard that squawk. He came running, and he leaped. He almost caught the pheasant, but I shot, and my gun was up then, and I shot the pheasant. I almost hit Randy, the dog. But it's something, and now we finished our time in Springfield, and I attended, or we hadn't finished it, but I attended a management school in Daytona Beach, Florida, run by the Life Insurance Agency Management Association. And while there, they became interested in me in becoming a consultant for them. And this was a job where that people that they took from a company normally would go back to the company they came from, but they would agree to stay 4 years, and they gained a tremendous amount of experience. So I was very interested in that, and agreed to accept the job. And so this was in 1959. So in 1959 we moved to Connecticut. On the trip there, I recall most vividly that we hit New York City. When we crossed the George Washington Bridge, it was right at the time people were getting off, and the traffic was so heavy, and I got a little lost, and we wound up down by the zoo. And but we finally got to Connecticut, and as a family, and I suppose this might be a good time to take it. This is something that happened while we lived in Miami that I think would be very interesting. It's a story I wrote for Angie, and Senator. It's entitled "The Night of the Python" by Grandpa. We might think of each day in our life as being a paragraph in the story to be written in the history of our lifespan. Some are so blasé that we can hardly remember events of a particular day as recently as last week. Other days have memorable events that stay with us a week, a month, or possibly a year or two. However, certain days are indelibly inscribed in our minds, and those are days last forever. They cannot be erased or forgotten. Such a day was Tuesday, June 18th, 1996. It began like most days, up about 7:30 with the normal exercises for my body to limber up without creaking or groaning, then the usual toiletries and shower, a breakfast of cereal with peaches, blueberries, strawberries, and banana topping. I love this time of the year when fruits are in season. After breakfast and reading the paper, a trip to the drugstore and some light grocery shopping, enjoying the sunshine, the warm weather, and even the rain. There was not a hint that this was one of those days, which would be inscribed in my mind as if it were inscribed in stone. But unbeknownst to the event was drawing closer. Very important to this story is the fact that we live on the 26th story in a penthouse condominium, a place where you feel secure from the world, a guarded entrance to the ground, plus security at the front desk of the building, a place where you watch various species of birds, large and small, soar around this and adjoining buildings, a place where you would never expect something from the jungles of South America, a place of contentment and serenity. That's exactly what you expect and what you get, except for the night of June 18th, 1996. There wasn't a sunset to see on this night because of approaching thunderstorms. However, one felt secure from the flashing, lightning, and the roar of the storm because you were inside a cool and comfortable setting. Again, not knowing what the night and darkness would bring. Snakes, in my mind, had always been a sign of evil, probably from my backwoods environment where everyone told how Eve was tempted by the snake to commit the original sin, disobeying God. I recall the day I was 10 years old then, when my 16-year-old sister died of strep throat. That day, a huge cow snake crawled up on the screen door, and was there for everyone to see who looked at the door. I remember someone saying this was a bad omen. Even with this background, I've always been fascinated with snakes. When we go to zoos, I enjoy going to the reptile house and seeing the various snakes in captivity. So long as I have a safe distance from snakes, I love to watch them. I can remember when I was on the farm and would accidentally step on a non-poisonous snake, I would walk on air for the next few yards, getting away from the snake. Anyway, I went to bed about 10:30 this night. Usually it's about 11 or 11:30 before I retire. But I went to sleep immediately. I awakened about 12:30 and sleepily stumbled into the bathroom. I never turn on the lights as I do not wish to disturb Grandma or Mar. There is a very dim light which enables me to make my way in or out without my glasses or stumbling into furniture. As I approached the commode, I thought I saw a shape that was one of Grandma's stockings on the side of the seat of the commode. I reached down to pick it up. Later, it turned out to be a dark brown spot or marking. When I did, I realized I had a hold of something alive, which was bigger than my arm. Immediately, I knew it was a snake, a big snake. I yelled and walked on air to the door of the bathroom and hit the light switch. No one, not even Grandma, could believe that I could move that fast. Grandma was immediately at the door as I exclaimed that there was the biggest snake that I had ever seen in our bathroom. She took one look, and she too was convinced. The snake was half in and half out of the commode, and you could only see about 18 inches of snake, but it was a big one. We hurriedly closed the door, and Grandma said, "Call security." We got the piece of paper that had the telephone numbers on it. However, guess what? We couldn't read them. Where were our glasses? You're right, they were in the bathroom. I said, "Grandma, go get our glasses." She replied, "You go." Fortunately, mine were close to the door. I opened the door crack and could see the snake was still crouched, sitting on top of the commode now. And in fact, he was coiled up with his head held high in an S-like position, similar to what you'd expect to see in Indiana Jones or guarding the tomb of one of the pharaohs. Needless to say, the door wasn't open very long. I snatched my glasses and shut the door. Now I could read the numbers, and I called the front desk, and no one answered. Then I dialed the front gate. When he answered, I told him the biggest snake I'd ever seen outside captivity was in my bathroom. His reply, a snake, kindly like, what have you been drinking or smoking? He said that someone would be up shortly. Before long, a knock on the door, and there stood a young security man with a baseball bat. When I opened the bathroom door, I wasn't looking at the guard, but Grandma was. She later told me that the look on his face when he saw the snake was something you'd never forget. Having seen people on television handling snakes, I suggested we get a bag and put the snake in the sack. So we got a garbage bag, a big one, to put the snake in. I did, and opened it up and put it on the floor so that the snake could be put into it. No one, not even Grandma, offered to hold the bag while which the snake would be put in. We were ready or the security man was, to capture the snake. When he touched it with his bat, it dived into the commode and was trying to get away and go down it. I yelled, "Don't let it get away," and he grabbed it by the tail with both hands, straining to pull the snake back, and finally he got it out, using the bat to keep the snake head away from him. And he guided it into the bag, and since the security man is about my height, which is, I'm 6'1", and he had his hand over his head, I would guess the snake to be about 7 foot long. His girth was about the size of my neck, and I wear a size 17 shirt, so you can give you an idea of the size of the snake we were dealing with. Considering the size of the commode opening down below, a snake must be like a rat, because he was going down it. In other words, they can go through a hole smaller than their body. If that snake had escaped, I don't think I could have ever sat with comfort on that seat again. So when you awake and ready for a paragraph in your life to be written, never assume that it's going to be a ho-hum day. It could be the day of the Python, or a day for you that you will never be forgotten. That's all I have to say about that. Yes, it's Monday, July the 30th, 2001, and we're continuing our discussion of my life, and at this point in time we're in 1959, and we're crossing the George Washington Bridge on our way to Connecticut. And I recall we made the wrong turn coming across the George Washington Bridge and wound up at downtown New York at rush hour. And I remember passing the zoo, and we were kind of like that shape at that time. We were hurrying to get to Connecticut, where we would spend the next 4 years, and they were a good 4 years. The job I had was with the Life Insurance Agency Management Association as a consultant, where I would have assigned to me 25 life insurance companies to consult with their training departments and agency departments and transferred to them all of our benefits that they had for belonging to the association, such as training and testing and so forth. It would be a great learning experience for Eva and I, because on the staff were 24 psychologists, and when you had an idea and you wanted to present it to a company, they would test it by going before them, and they would, you'd present your idea, and it better be well thought out, because they would tear it apart, and with you presenting it, and in doing that, it made you have to have your background right and your backup right for the ideas that you were presenting. And so it was a great experience. And in this, I taught in the management and the officers' schools. And I remember one experience that I had when I made a consultation call on the Metropolitan Life. And at that time, they were the largest life insurance company in the world. And as I walked into that building, here was a boy who had grown up in Kentucky and educated and lived in this very small town. And in this building, they had more employees than we had in the entire city or town that I came from of Winchester, Kentucky. And it was kind of an awesome to me. But I soon learned that I had some ideas which they appreciated, and it was a great confidence builder to me. From that time on, I realized that you could visit with anyone, and if you had ideas that you could take to them, that you could do the job. And we had a lot of good experiences as a family while we were there. I traveled 2 weeks out of the month and calling on companies or teaching in schools. And one of the places where we had a school each spring was in New Hampshire at Rye Beach, New Hampshire, at the Farragut Hotel. And as a result of that, the owner of the hotel would invite us back during the summer for some vacation and at minimum costs. And I remember taking the family there, and I represented the hotel in their golf tournaments in the resort hotels, and we won a couple of years. But one time I was out hitting some practice shots, and this fella came up and sat down and started talking to me, and we chatted maybe for 45 minutes, and he told me what his name was, Bobby Darin, but that didn't mean anything to me. But that night at dinner, it was the hotel was on the American style, or American plan, they called it, where you with your room you got all the meals and everything. And so we're sitting there. I had first I should back up a little bit. And I had taken the children and gone because we had planned on going as a family, but Eva's mother died, and so I took Marv and Janet and Mary Sue and Janet's friend Sue Thompson along with me for the week we were going to spend up there. And that night when we were there for dinner, and Bobby Darin walked in, Janet and Sue, and they went kind of ape. "Oh, Daddy, do you know who that is?" And I said, "Yeah, I was out talking to him this afternoon." And we spent about 45 minutes. Well, they said, "He's the greatest singer in the world. He's the man that wrote Mac the Knife." And it didn't mean a lot to me, but to them it was impressed them. And at the hotel there, we all had to dress and everything to go to dinner, and it was a good experience for the children and all of us, in fact. But for breakfast each morning, they'd always, for Mary Sue, bring out a little bowl of blueberries, and because she liked blueberries, and they found that out, so the waitresses, you had your own waitress and table assigned to you that you'd sit at each meal. but they'd always bring her a bowl of blueberries, and they got to the point where they called her Blueberry. Here's the Blueberry Girl. And I remember one time that we took the owner and I took some of the kids there at the hotel out on a fishing boat. And the water was a little rough that day, but Mary Sue, she would have been about 6 years old at the time, maybe, and she was just having fun. She was baiting everybody's hooks, putting the bait on the hooks for them, and poor Marv, he was not handling the weather too well. He was up checking over the side, but anyhow, we had a good time, and I remember how she didn't seem to bother her at all. And so we had a lot of memorable. I remember Marv going in the water up there and that water was just ice cold. I put my toe in it. I couldn't take it. They'd almost turned blue. And but we had a lot of good memories from New Hampshire. Then I recall one year we was having a meeting in Florida, and I took the family along, and we drove down from Connecticut, and Marv and Janet and Mary Sue and Mother and I recall as we go along, I'd make up songs from Three Little Fishes and the Mother Fishy Too, and like when the little fishes go over the dam and the mother can't get to them and so forth, and they can't get back, and I'd make up all kinds of stuff about that, and how finally the rains came and the water raised to where it was up even with the dam, and they got back together as a family, and we'd have a lot of fun, and we had bought our first convertible there, a Chevrolet Impala. And I remember it's the first car we had that had seat belts. And so I said, family, we bought this car, and it has seat belts, and we're all going to use them. And from that day since, I've always used my seat belt when I get in the car, and I hope they do too. And I recall while we lived there too, we had good neighbors. We liked them a lot, and the one gentleman that lived on one side of me, he had a greenhouse, and I would go over there a lot of times in the evening while he was working in his greenhouse, and we'd have good chats. But one time I went over, and he told me, he said, Jay, I've really got bad news. And I said, oh, tell me about it. And he said, well, I learned, I'm 55 years old, and I had planned all my life that I would be able to retire at 55 and do the things that just I wanted to do, like work in my greenhouse wherever we wanted to go and so forth. And he said, today I learned I had cancer, and he said, you can have everything you want in life, but if you don't have health, you don't have anything. And that conversation has always stuck with me, that how important our health is. And during that stay in Connecticut, as I said earlier, we traveled a lot. And on one trip, I was gone to down in Alabama, going to wind up in Ohio, then back to Hartford. And on this particular trip, my sister, Mary Ruth, lost her son, Scott, he died from leukemia. He was like 5 years old. And they had called me, so I went to change my plans and went to be with her. And, but my schedule had called for me to be on a TWA Constellation, Trans World Airlines, is TWA, and so that plane ran into a United jet, one of the earliest jets, over New York City. And they showed pictures in Life magazine of the fuselage being down in Brooklyn and people trying to get out and so forth. But anyhow, the point of it was I was scheduled to be on that plane. And they announced that I had called Eva that I had changed my plans, but I hadn't necessarily, I don't know as I called the office, but they announced at the office that I was scheduled on the plane and they thought I was there. And I recall when I got back, I remember how people would come into the office and say, "Jay, good to see you. Glad you're back." And I wonder, at that time, I wondered why everybody was so, because we traveled a lot, and people didn't come in and say, "So glad," might say, "Good to see you back. Have a good trip, I hope," or whatever. But I noticed that it was more effusive at that time, and they didn't tell me for a year or so that they had announced at the office that they thought I was on the plane and wouldn't be back anymore. And so that was the reason I think everyone was so glad to see me. But it was a wonderful 4 years that we spent in Connecticut. Both Eva and I both grew socially and personally, personal growth. And I worked for a man by the name of Lou Chapman was the man that hired me and that I admired so much. And he taught me one thing that I've always remembered. He said, never be surprised when people act like people. And so therefore that you're going to run into people some days that they are not in the best of moods and they might react as they normally don't react. And it's something that I've always thought. So never be surprised when people act like people, and always give them the benefit of the doubt. So it's 1963, the late part of 1963. My 4 years have come to an end, and as I said, they've been a wonderful learning experience. And so I was had fulfilled my 4 years as per was agreed in the beginning, and now I was able to accept offers from other companies. And there was a company in Memphis, Tennessee, known as the National Burial Insurance Company, and they approached me about coming to their company and helping them become a true life insurance company. And so we moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and I went in latter part of '63 for a month. Then the family came in '64. So we had bought our first house in Connecticut, and so we sold it and got out okay, and we bought a house in Memphis, which was a 4-bedroom brick home with about 3,000 square feet, and it was a beautiful home, a nice home, and so we moved into it. But this was a cultural shock for the kids, Janet and Marv and Mary Sue. Things were pretty formal in Connecticut. The schools were very good, and they were operated very formally. Whereas in Memphis, when they got there, I remember them coming home, and Marv said, "You know, the teacher, he just had an open shirt, he didn't have a coat and tie on, and he put his feet up on the desk," and this was a complete change for them. And so finishing out that year, we said to Janet, "Well, we'll get you into a different school." So she went to Hutchinson School for Girls, which was very formal and very good school as considered in Memphis, and Marv went to Christian Brothers High School, in which they liked very much. And The company I worked for was family owned. So the first thing, if we wanted to become a life insurance company, I said, we need a different name. So we wound up changing the name of the company from the National Burial Insurance Company to the National Trust Life Insurance Company. And in this transition, it was kind of tough because here they had been very successful. They owned the funeral homes and the life insurance and the burial insurance company. And there was a suit brought against them, and they had to dissolve being selling burial policies because it was a kind of a monopoly-like situation. And all the people that worked for the company had about 200 and some odd agents and several offices, both in Memphis and Chattanooga, Tennessee, that we needed to change. But there was two brothers had started the company, and there was now they're descendants. They both had the same amount of children, so they had equal control of the company. And they appointed me on the board of directors, and I was one of the first people outside the company to ever be on the board of directors. And I recall they'd get into pretty strong arguments at some time, and all at once one would turn to me and say, "Which side are you on?" And I remember I had I'd say, "I'm not on anybody's side. I'm on the company's side. Now, if you wish to ask me what I think is best for the company, I'll be happy to give you an opinion. But don't ask me what side I'm on, because I'm not on a side. I thought I was appointed to the board to be on the company's side." And I recall many times having to say that, and I recall many times the chairman of the board saying, "Jay is right. That's what all of our objectives should be." And but at that time many in the company saw me as a threat because they had very secure jobs. They were making twice as much as most people made, and many of them, the management people, the second level management, they'd come in for an hour each day and leave. They had other businesses and jobs and so forth. And so to save them and to allow them to make this transition, I called everyone together and I said, "I understand if I were in your position and somebody came in and said, 'We're going to change it, that you're going to have to now work 8 hours a day or 9 hours a day,' I would be upset too. But I said, there won't be any company here to work for if we don't change." And as a result, I got death threats and letters, and one day somebody came running into my office and said, one of the men's downstairs and he has a gun. And the executive vice president brought me a gun. And I had some assistant vice presidents and several secretaries in my office, which comprised a pretty good space. But anyhow, I went out and told everyone to go down into the lunchroom and the recreation room, and I would send for them. I didn't tell them what the problem was. But anyhow, I left the door open my door open, which was a corner office, so that I could see the entrance to our division. And I'm sitting there, and I get to thinking to myself, now here I am, supposedly a sophisticated type individual, and here I am like in a Western situation at the OK Corral. And I was kind of laughing to myself, and due to the fact in a situation like this, you would call the police. But this particular individual was the uncle of the chairman of the board. So it was a kind of a dicey situation, but we got it settled. And he didn't come up, and I didn't have to use the gun, but I carried it for a while, and I kept one in my car because I wasn't afraid for myself, but I was worried about my family. A person of that mental capacity in major worry, and so I knew that the sheriff, and I talked to him, and I told him the situation, and he said that we'll keep watch, and if he comes within so many blocks of your home, I forget exactly what we said, but he said, you call me and we'll pick him up. Or we'll watch him, we'll call you, and you can tell us what to do. That's the way he put it. And so it went on, but we got that finally settled, but I remember the chairman telling me, he said, Jay, I'll never forget what you've done for us, and putting up with the situation, and we did make a successful change and sold a lot of insurance, and things were pretty good. But in 19 and while there's a few other stories that I wanted to tell you. Mary Sue always loved horses from that time. I set her on the saddle when she was 6 years old, or about that, in Connecticut. So now she's about 10, somewhere around 10, I would say, at this time. And we got her a horse, and it was a Palomino. I bought it, and she loved that horse, and she called it Frito, F-R-I-T-O. And but anyhow, that was her first horse. And then Janet was up at dating age now, and so she was dating a boy that lived down the street by the name of Alan Keller. And during that time, I also, while I was there, one of the sporting things I did was quail hunt. I love to watch a dog work. It's one of the most beautiful sights in the world, to see a dog running full speed and throw on his, stiffen up on scent and slide to a halt. But yeah, I loved quail hunting, and I did a lot of it. So one Saturday I had been quail hunting, and I'd left my shotgun sitting in the corner. Of course, it was unloaded and everything, but I had gone to bed because I was tired from the day's hunt, and Eva came in, running in, and she said, Janet went to let Misty, that was her dog, and I'll tell you about Misty in just a few minutes, but Misty out, and someone grabbed her. Well, I leaped out of the bed in my pajamas, and I was barefooted and everything, and I grabbed the shotgun and ran out, and I figured if anybody caught her, in the back of our house was woods, and we had a big deck back there, and I said that's where they would go. So I ran around the house, and I couldn't find anyone, and I came to the front door, and I said, Eva, get my slippers. I said, I was barefooted in my pajamas, and so she did, and as she brought them to the door and I slipped my house slippers on, I heard a moan up at the noise up by the mailbox, which it was dark out there. We didn't have street lights or anything. We were out in kind of the country, and they had about an acre lot the house was on. And anyhow, Eva groaned, oh no, or something like that, and I started running, and I could see forms up at the mailbox. And as I got there, it was Janet and Alan. They'd had a little spat, and since he lived across this one block around, she was going to have the last word, so she cut through. And by the time he drove home, and anyhow, they had walked back, and they were up by the mailbox. And if he'd have started running, I probably would have shot him. But come to find out later, I'd forgotten to load the gun. There wasn't any shells in it. But we could imagine, we got back in the house and began to think about it, and it wasn't all that funny. But there I was in my pajama, and and Eva in her nightgown, and if somebody looked out and saw this man with a shotgun in his pajamas, and her running, but they had made up, and they had gotten, everything was okay, and but they came in and thought it was funny, and I told them it wasn't funny at all, that Eva had overreacted in saying someone had grabbed her because she had thought the last one in would always let Misty out. But I got to back up a little bit and tell you about Misty, how I got her. Misty was a beagle hound, and Mary Sue had always wanted a dog also, plus a horse. So this friend of mine had a beagle had pups, and Misty was very small at that time, and he gave Misty to me, and I brought her home. When I got home, I put her inside my shirt. I didn't have the stomach I have today, but there was room inside my shirt for the pup. And so I unbuttoned a couple of buttons, and Mary Sue was laying on the couch. She had a cold or something. We had a fire going in the fireplace, and I walked over to the couch, and that pup, Misty, stuck her head out. And will never forget the look in her eyes and the glow from the fireplace when she saw that pup, and she said, "Daddy, you got me a dog." And so, but Misty was a large part of our life from then on. I'll have to tell stories about her as we go along. Then Janet got married in 1967, and it was a great matchup. Back then, I'm not sure I was all that enthused about the man she married, but she made a great decision, because we got a wonderful son-in-law by the name of Alan Keller. And then another thing that I remember is Marv was, in 1969, he was ready to go to college. So I took him down to my clothing store, and we bought all these clothes, which was a lot back then. A nice overcoat, nice pants and suits and things that I thought that people needed in college. But we bought all these clothes, and about all he ever wore was blue jeans while he was there, I think, because they were good. I remember almost 10 years later of wearing his overcoat when I lived in, that I had bought him when we lived in Illinois, which was to come later. But in 1970, the company was sold, merged with another insurance company, and so I decided to resign and form my own company, in which I didn't have it. It was a consulting company, and one of the first jobs I had was to go to California, that they were looking for someone, and thought maybe I might be able to find the type of person that they wanted. And it was Forest Lawn Memorial Parks and Mortuaries. Well, I went out there on the purpose of maybe finding someone for them, and in my consultation experience and so forth, and they talked me into taking the job. And it was a beautiful operation, and they were the largest mortuary and cemetery operation in the world at that time. And so in 1970, Janet's gone, Marv's in college, Mary Sue's left, and the three of us moved to California. And we had a beautiful home there up on the hill, and had a swimming pool, a Japanese gardener, and a flower in bloom every day of the year, some type. It was set up so. And the job was very good, but and of course, we moved Misty with us. She had to go. And I remember Misty would always want me to talk me into taking her walks and so forth, and so I'd walk her out and we'd look over the San Fernando Valley and we could see a million lights while they're on the site there. And she would always run out with me in the morning when I'd go down the driveway to pick up the paper. And this particular morning, she walked out with me, and she wasn't the greatest of man, but this particular morning I picked the paper up and she was going to take off, and I wrapped my paper against my hand and I said, "Misty, you come here." And I can remember she hopped up on with 3 legs and began to walk and looked up at me like, "You wouldn't hit a crippled dog, would you?" And she wasn't crippled at all. Anyhow, she got back in the house, and the other experience we had with her, that there's glass sliding doors all on the back of the house led out to the swimming pool. And it was Christmas. It must have been Christmas Eve because, as I recall, she and Mary Sue were playing running back and forth through the house. And Mary Sue had run through and closed the door real fast out to the pool, and Misty went right through that sliding glass door into a million pieces. And Eva was telling me that Mary Sue was just, I thought, oh, Misty was hurt, but she wasn't. Actually, it was shattered through type of glass that when they hit, they moved. But we couldn't find anyone to fix the glass that time. And so we had to put I remember putting cardboard up until we could get the glass replaced, and after the holiday. And another story about Misty was, while we were there, we had the earthquake. It was a terrible earthquake, and it happened about like 6 or 7 early in the morning before we'd gotten up. But anyhow, the house, I woke up and the house was going back and looked like it was tilting all like this. And it's the only time in my life that I ever felt hopeless, or not, I won't say hopeless, it's not the word, but I didn't know what to tell the family what to do. Normally in emergency, I'd always say, you do this, do that, whatever. And here, I didn't know. And I'm laying there thinking, and well, what if that I'd read in papers where mountains would come crashing down and inundate villages and so forth. And right back of our swimming pool, you went out the back, then you went right up a mountain, a rock cliff for about 200 or 300 feet. And I got thinking, well, that could come over. But anyhow, it was quite an experience. But the thing about Misty, the shocks went on for several days after aftershocks. But she would hear them before I would, because it would sound like a train coming through, and you'd hear it coming up the mountain, and boom, it's past, now it's past you, and the house would shake a little. But she would hear them before I would. And she would come running and jump into the chair with me and until they passed. But it was quite an experience. And we also, some other experiences that we had in California was that we would go, we had box seats we could get that the company had at Dodger Stadium, and we used those quite often to go watch the Dodgers play. And Mary Sue, after I had told her before we left Memphis that she could give her horse away, because I had checked and it would cost $2,000 to get her horse by train out there. And because they had to take it off and feed it every so many hours, they couldn't leave them and so forth. They explained it all to me. But I had said, well, give your horse if you want to a person. If you can't get any money for it, then I'll get you a horse when we get to California. And so I did, and she took up riding, and she was very good. She even went to the national championships representing California. And so she had her horses there. And also, Johnny Carson used to make a lot of jokes about Forrest Lawn. So a lot of his opening jokes would be talking about Forrest Lawn. So one night we went to see Johnny Carson, taped the show. And as another one of my assistants, training men, went along with me, and his name was Nelson Byers. But we went, and as we settled into our seats, we gave the page boy that had taken us back, we gave him our business cards, and just thought Johnny would get a laugh about it, because here was a couple of Forest Lawn people. But anyhow, when he came on, he said, well, we got a couple of special guests tonight. And he introduced us and said he was going to lay off of any jokes that night about Forest Lawn, and the crowd hissed, of course. But it was kind of fun. I never realized, because I didn't stay up that late normally, how many people watched Johnny Carson. But just in a few days, I got a lot of calls and letters about the fact that my name was mentioned. So I guess that was my 1 minute of fame or something throughout the country. And we had a lot of interesting people that worked. I ran the before needs sales division of the company, and was vice president of it, and was also on the council of Forest Lawn. And but we had people who didn't quite make it, and some of them still had part-time. They'd do little scenes in movies, or comedians that would go to Las Vegas and talk and so forth. And but we had a lot of interesting people that worked for us, and one of them was Gordon Jump, who was the manager of KRPC in Cincinnati or something. He had quite a show there. And he's the Mr. Maytag man now that you see in advertising. And so Marv worked for him and he would do civic clubs and so forth for us, and telling about Forest Lawn and all the things that it had to offer. And in fact, Forest Lawn was the second greatest tourist attraction in Los Angeles at the time I was there, from 70 to 72. They had all of my reproductions of all of Michelangelo's works. They had the largest painting in the world, which if it was stood on end, it was inside a building, but it would be 9 stories tall. And a man spent his lifetime painting it. It was of the crucifixion and resurrection. A beautiful painting. So if anyone that goes to Los Angeles, I would suggest they go to Forest Lawn and see. They have replicas of all the little churches in the world, like the church in Boston, where they sent the signals out, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, little church. And as they are more weddings at Forest Lawn than any other place in Los Angeles, because people use those little churches. They're replicas, the little Scottish churches, and beautiful. So it's a good place to, it attracted a tremendous amount of people. And I remember George Burns used to come out to Gracie's, and that's where Marilyn Monroe was, and where, to this day and will last forever, Joe DiMaggio has paid to have a rose put on her, fresh rose, every week. And that's a lifetime thing that would go on. But it was interesting. And one other interesting personal experience I had while I was there was 2 of my managers. One of them was Maddie Wilson, and the other was her husband, Paul. And they ran one of the offices for us, and each of them had a district. And but he got sick with cancer. And one Saturday morning I woke up and I said, you know, I should go to the hospital and see Paul. I don't know why, but when I arrived there, he died within about an hour, and I was with Maddie at that time, and she's been a friend even before that, but ever since, and we've always had a closeness. Maddie, if she had been a man, would headed up some large corporation. That's how good she was and how good a business person she was, and she's a wonderful individual. So and Marv, while we were there, he came back for a period of time from the University of Tennessee and took some courses at a junior college there. And he participated in an art contest while he was there, and he won the top award. He painted did a painting of the Vietnam War. I remember it had a barbed wire was in it, and somewhere, I don't know where the painting is today, but he won first prize. Now in I had a wonderful job, and the pay was awfully good, and I worked with very good and wonderful people. But that was just my cup of tea. I realized it after a couple of years. I didn't get excited. I wasn't excited over it or anything. So I formed my own company and moved back to Memphis, Tennessee, known as, the company was named Master Plan of Tennessee. And our thrust was that we changed. I was one of the forerunners in the change of the concepts of life insurance in this country, which we sold, brought term insurance into being in a big way. And I had a lot of success with it. I had my own pilot and plane, but I had a contract with Cecil Day, who founded Days Ends of America, and which is a big company now, and I'll tell you this because of the type of man that he was. I had a company that would find money for people and so forth, and one of the jobs that we did. And I had made contact with some people in Europe that had a lot of money and wanted to lend it out. And so I suggested he go to England and talk with them. He was looking for this, and I had a contract which would have paid me $8 million. And he went over, and they met him with all the hoopla and everything and took him to this meeting, but they opened the meeting up by, now if we could do away with this contract you have with Foley, company, we could save you $8 million. And he got up and walked out. As he wrote me later that he didn't do business with people like that. That he'd always operated on a straightforward basis. And if they were people like that, he didn't want to do business with them. So maybe I should have gone to England with him at that time. But I didn't think it was necessary. Everybody assured me that it was just either they did or they didn't. They wanted to hear his side, not my side of the story. But anyhow, it was an interesting experience. And unfortunately, I changed my insurance companies, my carriers, to ITT Life. And we had a very unfortunate experience, and I lost everything I had up to that time. And they told me, this was before we'd sue for everything, but anyhow, we had a showdown, and they told me they could keep me in court they had 150 lawyers on staff, and they could keep me in court for my lifetime, so we separated, but I found out later that they had their anticipation, and the thing they wanted was my people. They didn't want my company, so to speak. They wanted to pirate the people that I had. And I had people in Louisiana, Indiana, not Indiana, Louisiana, Tennessee, Florida, Georgia, and all the southeastern states. And that's what they wanted, and they wound up with most of them. But anyhow, it was an unfortunate experience. And as a result of that, that was from 72 to 76, I said, okay, I've had enough of this type of work. I am just going to be concerned about myself from now on. And so we moved to Chicago, Illinois. This was 1976, and we were there until 1989. And I have a lot of ability, and I've always felt all my life I never worried about a job, never applied for jobs. They always came to me, except I may have later in Chicago, but I didn't take a job. So, but in those years I played a lot of golf. I belonged to a men's club there, and I'd always said before that I would never, two cities I would never live in. One of them would be New York and one Chicago. Well, as it wound up, I lived in Chicago the longest I did in any other place, because I lived and during my lifetime I've lived in 22 locations in 9 states. And and then in 1977, the year after we moved to Chicago, Mary Sue and Blaine married, and she too got a wonderful husband, and it was a beautiful match. She married Blaine Burnett. And but while I was in Chicago, as I started to say a moment ago, that one thing that I learned early in life, that I could sell. And if a person can sell, they never have to worry about a job. I never worried about making a living in my entire life, because I knew even now that if I had to, that I could go out and I could sell someone. And but wonderful things began to happen to us. In 1979, Nicole was born to Mary Sue and Blaine. And I recall now that she's married, but I can recall when we sat in a chair and we'd sing songs together, and one in particular, Tomorrow. We used to, when she was just a small tot, we'd sit in my big chair and we'd say, tomorrow, tomorrow, I love you, tomorrow, you're always a day away. And then Russ was born in 1980, and Russ had the best eye-hand coordination I've ever seen in a youngster during my lifetime. He could, I remember when he was 4 or 5 years old, we'd go out to play ball, and he could hit that darn ball farther, and finally, it got to the point where I used to tell him, now, Russ, I'll go out and play ball with you, but you're going to go get the ball where you hit it, because he'd wear me out trying to go get the ball. Then Doug was born in 1983, and one of the good memories I have of that is that he came down with his dad, was down there for a day at some meeting, or maybe it was a day or two, I'm not sure. I don't recall exactly, but anyhow, I said, Doug, we'll go fishing today. So we went out and we dug the worms, and we went over to the golf course where they had some lakes there, and we put our poles out, and we began to catch little brim and some small catfish. But he threw it out and all at once there was a big splash, and here, wham, the cork went diving down the water, and he had hooked a bass. And so anyhow, we got it in, and he brought it home, and he said, I want to take that home and show Mama. I said, well, Doug, I don't think that fish will make it there and alive and so forth. And I said, but I said, you can take the catfish, and I think he took a brim also, a little. They're pretty hardy, so they live. But he took those back. And then we used to all go to Janet's for Thanksgiving. And Nikki would be, she was the director then, so she'd line them all up, and they'd do little shows for us, and just beautiful memories. And then there's one thing that I did while I was in Chicago that is stuck in my mind. Probably it's something that I did that did the most benefit of anything I've done in my life. And that was, I had a friend by the name of Tony Compeon, Compean, and his wife, Charlene. But anyhow, Tony and I would do some things together, play some cards over at the golf club and play some golf occasionally. But one day, and he and I were going to the races. We were going to Arlington Park and to see the horse races. And he said, Jay, I'm just bought a little, or setting up a little company and put my wife in business. And he said the bank suggested that maybe we buy some life insurance. And I said, well, I'll come by tomorrow and take care of it. And so the next morning I was there, and we filled out the application. When I got down where it asked how much insurance is on the husband, he had only like $80,000, a small policy. And they had 4 children. And so I said, Tony, I don't write more life insurance on the wife than I do the husband. We're going to put at least a couple of $100,000 on you also. So I wrote a policy, and I put everything, all these problems he'd had, health problems, on the application and everything, and we sent it off, and it was issued. And but in the winters, even I would go to visit our good friend Bill and Ruth guy in Arizona. So it was that winter that we had gone out, and I came back. We'd been gone maybe for a month, and I came back, and someone said, did you hear what happened to Tony? And I said, no, what? And they said he had a stroke. He was over at the golf club where we gathered to play cards, and of course we'd play golf, but afterwards play golf and visit with each other. And he said he was sitting in a chair, and he just fell out, and he hasn't been able to speak a word since, and he's was in the hospital. Now they got him in a nursing home. And so I immediately left and went to see Charlene, and I said, Charlene, I just heard about this. And she reiterated what had happened to him, and he hadn't been able to speak a word since he fell to the floor there at the golf club. And so I went to see Tony, and of course he was just staring straight ahead and laying, but as I took his hand, touched his hand and so forth, I know a little tear tinkled down his face, and I knew he knew who I was and what I had done, because he sensed that he only lived a very short time after that. Well, but anyhow, backing up just a section, I said to Charlene, when I first saw her, I said, now the insurance, it's paid and everything, isn't it? She said, no, I haven't had the money to send off for the last payment. And I said, get it real quick. So she got a notice, and it would have expired, the grace period would be up the next day if it wasn't paid. And I said, Charlene, it's got to be paid. I said, you know, So anyhow, she said, well, we've run out of money, hospital and nursing home and everything. And I said, Charlene, I can't, the law says I can't pay your premium because that's against the rules and regulations. But I said, I'm going to need some secretarial work, and I'd like to contract with you to take care of that when you're able to. And so I gave her a couple of $100 or whatever it was at that time. And so her father drove the company, the insurance company was in Milwaukee that we'd put the business through. So her father drove that up there. And anyhow, he died a short time thereafter. And they said, oh, it won't pay off because we haven't had it all that long and everything. I said, well, it'll pay off because I always put everything on the application. I don't kid my companies, nor do I kid my clients. And I tell them to give everything. So anyhow, they did pay off. They contested it, but it took about a couple of months or so. It was a very short time, but interest rates were high at that time. So finally I got the check plus the interest from the day he died because they had questioned paying it off. And it was, I remember it was over $208,000 and change. And so when I delivered that check, and they were able to stay together as a family, and she incidentally was pregnant, and shortly after he died, the baby was born, another one, which made the 5. But that family was able to stay together because of what I had done, and I've always felt good about it. And when I see her and she holds my hand just a little tighter and maybe a little longer, you know what I think about what I had done. And so that's an experience I wanted to share with you because I felt like that that sometimes we've done things. And as a family, we've gone to Janet's for Thanksgiving many times, and the grandkids would put on the show. Then I would like to read and put in the contact some of our family and thinking and doing a couple of poems. One that I wrote in '88 and one in '89. And this was the one I wrote for Thanksgiving, 1988. It's the middle of November. There's excitement in the air. Thanksgiving is coming soon, and all the Foleys and their spouses will be there. Marv will be coming from Tampa, the Burnett's from Ann Arbor, Jay and Eva from Hoffman Estates, a little bit farther. Where will all these folks be traveling so far to see? To Youngstown, of course, where Janet and Alan will be. They will open the door, greeting us with their big smiles. We will immediately concede it was worth driving all those miles. There will be warm greetings and lots of kissing. If other families do not have this love, what are they missing? There will be comments about Grandpa's weight and Grandpa's belly. The next comment, pass Grandpa the jelly. Nikki will tell all about her feats at school. Everyone will recognize that she's not a fool. Russ will tell us about his experiences on the T-ball team, how proud the family was in building his esteem. Then there's Doug, bringing a smile to our lips, telling us fish stories, one of his pips. Angie, as usual, will play hard to get at, running to Mommy at the drop of a hat. There will be great food, discussions of the stuffing. Should there be more onion, more cornbread muffin? Compared to last year, everyone seems to think it's as good. Grandpa silently smiles and knows this is the way it should be, because the turkey dressing has always been, perfect dressing has always been their quest, and he hopes they can never say this is the best. Then what would they talk about? Cranberry sauce or green stuff? Let's talk turkey. Let's get tough. There's where the meat is. It's the solution of the day. Another feat for Alan. Before we eat, let's pray. Dear God in heaven, Grandpa and Grandma are so thankful to you for giving us Janet Gale, Jay Marvin, and Mary Sue. Also, Alan, Blaine, Nikki, Russ, Doug, and Angie too. Without all of them, what would we do? Each of them makes our chests fill with pride. To give us such pleasure, you must be on our side. Thank you for this food and all desolation. May there be happiness throughout the nation. Thanksgiving 1988. Now, Thanksgiving 1989. The family is in a period of change. Mom and Dad to Florida, Mary Sue to the Oregon Range. So this year, instead of going to Youngstown, we're all scattered about and around. All will miss the gathering of the clan, a moment that is difficult to withstand. Our memories will be of Thanksgiving shared, the love, laughs, and emotions of those who cared. We knew without a doubt the love is pure. Past Thanksgiving thoughts will bring laughs for sure. Especially, was the turkey too tender or too tough? Discussions of the dressings and the green stuff. Entertainment of Nicole, Russ, and Doug. Thunderous applause and Angela on the rug. So as each of you sits at the table this year, smile and be happy. Don't shed a tear. We will experience the emotions, if not together, knowing Mary Sue has a horse, Mom and Dad the weather. Dad and Mom are very thankful this special day for Nikki, Russ, Doug, Angela, Blaine, Alla, Mary Susan, Janet, and Jay. P.S. May many happy moments for each of you unfurl. Mom and Dad and Jay are off to Disney World. Love, Mom and Dad. On the show. Then in 1989, the Burnett's moved to Oregon, and we moved to Tampa, Florida, with our son Marv. Then we were there for just a short time. We moved to Citrus County, and we did some things there. We loved living in Citrus County and enjoyed it. About 10 minutes. 15. Okay, so there, but the many good times that we had at Janet's and so forth together with the family, but as I say, we moved to Citrus County in 1990, and we were there until 1993, and we moved to Miami to be with Marv, who had transferred there, and so then in 2001, February this year, Janet and Mary Sue came down, and they helped us move to where we are at the current time. Then last year, Nikki got married to Jason Douglas, and which was quite an event, and so we have been, and I have been, a very lucky man. I was so lucky when I married Eva. No one could have gotten a better wife than I did. And I have been so lucky to have Janet and all the wonderful experiences that I've had with her, and what a good human being she is. And Marv is a great son. He is a good human being, and Mary Sue, what a wonderful daughter, and she's given me four of the greatest grandkids anybody could ask for. If they were cloning them, they'd love to clone them. So it's been a a good 75 years for me, and as I say, I've been the luckiest man that anybody could ask for. And I thank God every day for, or I try to every day. If I miss a day, I might do it twice the next day. But for the family that I've had, and I feel like that I'm not a wealthy man at all, far from it, but I am a very rich man as a result of the family that I have. And it's been fun and brought back a lot of memories going through this, and I've enjoyed it very much. And thanks to Douglas for his patience and direction in putting all this together.
To be at bed. Well, I wanna wing, wing, give me wing, wing.